All right, welcome everybody to the special City Council workshop meeting of September 24th, 2021. Ms. Hilbrick, would you please do the quorum?
Okay. Councilman De La Garza
I am present.
and Councilman
Testing.
Crocker.
Here.
Councilwoman Scott,
I am present.
Councilman Young,
Here.
Councilman Lofgren,
I'm here.
Mayor Bachnight,
Here.
and I'm not seeing Mayor Pro Tem Solis at
She
this
is on her way. She just
Okay.
texted me. She got caught by
All
a
right.
train.
So she'll be here in a moment. Thank you.
You got another shortcut.
Yeah. If everybody will please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. If you'll remain standing, today we're going to have a moment of silence, and one of our former officers, Victoria Police Department officer Philip Baron, passed away this morning, and please keep him in your thoughts as we observe this moment of silence. Thank you. All right, we're going to jump into items from council. Does anybody have any item they'd like to bring up? None? I have one. I want everybody to take a look at a proposed speed hump policy, and I believe there's a couple of slides that Mr. Garza could present.
Yeah, whoa. This mic really works. All right. Yes, staff did prepare a few slides. I want to ask Ken to come up and kind of walk through them a little bit. This has been a conversation that really we've had for a little over a year now, because I know it's been of interest of now Mayor Bachnight, but was an interest to him even beforehand, ever since I arrived here. More recently, though, staff took the time to look at how other communities structure speed hump policies, because at the end of the day, these need to be structured decisions. And so we want to show you a little bit of what we learned in that process and some items for consideration as we work together to potentially develop one for ourselves.
Is there a technical difference between a speed hump and a speed bump? Or is
Yes.
that the latest new terminology?
No, there's a major difference in terms of even just what it looks like, the construction.
Mr.
All of
Gill
that.
has all that explained.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Ken, take it away.
Okay.
You have to talk into the mic, Ken. You didn't hear Ashley?
No. Is this one?
You can take off the one that's working.
No, you can't.
Or you could just stand behind the podium.
I'll do that. Okay. The water speed.
Moving that quarter on the ground.
Where'd it go? I didn't.
They can see it up here. There we go.
Okay, what are speed humps? Basically, it's a raised area in the street to reduce speed. They're typically 12 foot long, which you can look at that and say, okay, maybe it's 12 foot wide. They're about 3 to 4 inches high, so they're not a very highly raised. And if you're looking what a speed bump is, those are in parking lots. They're very short, 1 to 3 foot wide. They're 4 to sometimes 6 inches high. Those are private. You don't want to put a speed bump in a road because that's considered a hazard. Where are speed humps recommended? Only in residential, placed on streets with a quarter-mile continuous length, a regulatory speed of 30 miles an hour or less, which all of our residential streets are 30, and you don't want to put them where a driveway is located, close to an intersection, near fire hydrants. You use your judgment of where you want to put them, but typically it's between driveways in a residential area. Some of the things to consider is, and this is a typical what speed hump policies across the country, across the state, even outside of the United States, is a petition from 2/3 of the residents or households whose property butts the street segment. In other words, one person wants it, they go up and down the street and they try to get, they will get 2/3 of the people. If they agree, sign a petition, then we will look at the next steps, which is, again, city initiated versus citizen. That's a thing to consider. The other one is, do we want to put a minimum 85th percentile speed study on it to where you have to be over 35 miles an hour? Some cities have a speed limitation, some don't. That's something to consider. Another one to
Would you
consider,
explain what that means?
in
Is
other
that
words, is
85% of the people on the street are driving at 35.
Or
and the
greater.
And the speed limit is actually 30.
correct. 85%
Okay.
of the people are going over 35.
Thank you.
The next one is traffic counts. Do you want to consider that the traffic count has to be 500 vehicles per day? That is quite a lot of vehicles, but that's something to consider in these.
Or any other amount.
Or any other amount. And what I've done is I've taken speed hump policies, again, from other places and modeled them to what other ones in Texas are, so we wouldn't be sitting alone in these decisions you're looking at. Do you want multiple speed humps on a street? In other words, you got a long street, you don't want to just put one in the middle. It's not going to help. You have to space them out so many, 500 to 600 feet apart. Funding, that's another one to consider, is currently all we have is 3 patch trucks. And our city crews can do, about one every 2 days. If we go contractor, we don't have an asphalt contractor local in Victoria. So we'd have to hire that out. And we'd want to group it together to get as many as we could at one time to get the bang for the buck, should we hire a contractor. And that's really it, some things to consider. And I'll answer any questions, comments, discussion.
And I guess to be a tad more direct, one of the things that we would like to get specific feedback from council, and I know that was one of the reasons why Mayor Bachnight wanted to put it on the agenda to begin with, is if the majority of council even agrees with working towards having a speed hump policy. Because there are pros and cons, and I know you're probably wondering, well, geez, what are the cons? But oftentimes they can create issues because if the speed hump, for example, happens to be maybe not right in front of your driveway, but in front of your property, then potentially not all vehicles are created equal, right? And so some vehicles make noise when they go over a speed hump. And so that sometimes creates issues for those neighbors, unintended consequence of just additional noise caused by the speed hump. So typically in San Antonio, it would happen a lot where folks would want a speed hump and then city would work to put the speed hump, and then 6 months later, they're like, we want it removed. We don't like it. And so it's just one of those things, one of those growing pains that we'll probably have to go through if council wants to consider establishing the speed humps. Because this would be the first time that we do it, there might be an opportunity to collect or aggregate a certain amount of speed humps that maybe would be worthwhile outsourcing since it'd be the first run at it. But question one, does council want it and feel comfortable with us putting together a policy? And then second, if the answer is yes, do you feel comfortable with some of the parameters that we're talking about? Or maybe you might have others to consider as well.
What's going to be the main trigger for a request or a consideration from council? What's going to trigger it?
Well, I think there's two things that could trigger even just a conversation, right? One could be the residents themselves. Obviously, we have some residential areas that are a tad more organized than others. So realistically speaking, it might be easier for residential areas that are structured, whether it's through HOAs, whether formal or informal, probably would be easier for them to work together on trying to submit a request to the city. The other step would be us ourselves, just through our experience, through us recognizing the driving habits changing. I know that there's been conversation that with the median going into Navarro, it's going to increase traffic down the side streets. So that, for example, could be an example of something that we initiate simply because we know that it could be an issue. But ultimately, regardless of who initiates it, the criteria would be the same. And that's why establishing the criteria would be important. Now, we would then have to have a conversation about funding, which then would create a potential funding limitation, because if we only allocate, I'm going to make up a number, $50,000 a year for speed humps, I don't know how many speed humps that gets you. And once we reach that threshold, if requests come in after that money's been spent, well, then we would have to figure out, okay, well, do we wait until next year? Do we work to shift money around to just add more speed humps? And then eventually when the day comes when somebody asks to remove it, and that day will come because they won't all survive, then we would have to take into account the cost of the removal of the speed hump. But we can cross that bridge when we get to it. Currently, we don't have, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have a specific budget line item for speed humps. I know that it was briefly discussed during the budget development process, at least it was with Mayor Bachnight and I, but we currently do not have a specific line item for that. So that'd be something that we would have to just work with council on in the near future after the policy is adopted, assuming you want one.
When we looked at, these other options or criteria from different cities, did we get any feedback about, these cities said, hey, we adopted this and we wish we wouldn't have, or yes, it's been effective, or we didn't realize the maintenance costs, or did we just look at the policies themselves?
I looked at their policy, and as far as a lot of these have been initiated for years, so there's no change to them. It's consistent. The 2/3, I will say that is very consistent because, again, like Jesus said, is if I just arbitrarily say I want speed humps on this street, I got to put it in front of somebody's house who may be absolutely opposed to them. So that's the one thing I have not seen in any of the policies is we're just going to put them in.
Is it possible, Mr. Gill, to maybe mitigate the risk of putting one in and getting it ripped right back out, or request it to be taken out, to do a temporary one for a maximum of 3 months?
I have looked at those all online, and those are more in the range of a speed bump. They're going to be more drastic, and the one thing those are is they're hard plastic. Okay, they're about 3-4 foot wide if you're looking at one. And when you lay those across the street, you got to remember no street is perfectly level, and when that car hits it, it's going to be loud when they hit them. It's like hitting a steel plate over a pothole. It's going to be loud. And that's why I didn't really look at those other cities. As far as I know, they might use those in a parade or a situation where you really want to stop them.
And communities have actually shifted. The San Antonio did this. San Antonio started with the rubber plastic ones because they also were thinking, okay, emergency vehicles. And so oftentimes those are only 4 feet wide or placed with a gap in between to allow the larger vehicles to just flow through. And that was a thought process then. But the noise issue became a concern. And so then San Antonio actually started doing some in asphalt, but also doing them where there was gaps for the larger vehicles to drive through. And so in that experience, they went away from the hard plastic because of the noise, but still went with an asphalt product that still had the gaps for the wheelbase of like a fire truck, for example. But like I said, it's just going to be growing pains for us, trial and error, because we've never done it. And we just want to see if you want to trial and error it at the beginning and see what happens.
Oh, we did it 40 plus years ago.
Well, I'm thinking there's a couple of streets that council's heard about over the years. I remember there used to be a problem on Greenwood and Redwood, and I don't know if that's still a problem. We're just not hearing about it. That was even before I got on council, and I know what Woodway is one of
Chimney
those
Rock,
streets.
Blythe,
Yeah.
and North Crest that people used to cut through.
Lilac.
And so, maybe more so than a street in a subdivision where there happen to be young children right now, and so the people want a speed hump, but in 10 years, there aren't going to be young children there anymore, that might be something to think about differently than the roads that I'm talking about really are almost thoroughfares, or I don't know what the right terminology
collectors.
is.
Well, and that's why
Yeah.
oftentimes you find minimum requirements for number of vehicles, which ends up not being right in the middle of a neighborhood because you normally don't have 500 vehicles going through a neighborhood.
Right.
But if it's a quasi cut through street, quasi collector, maybe.
Yeah, I think we would have to tailor a lot of those criteria that were presented to Victoria. I realize that they're looking everywhere for them, but we have our own unique situations and circumstances, and we got to take that into account if we're going to come up with a policy and not follow others. Just make it for us if we do it.
Ken, I had a question. In regards to that 85th percentile above a certain speed limit, do you figure that out by putting a radar?
Yes, you would have to put,
So would that not, don't people see that and slow down automatically?
they have those available where it looks like a speed limit sign, and you can put those up to where it's nobody knows it's really there, that's what it's doing.
Okay.
They are available.
I just wanted a true assessment,
Yes.
not
Right.
And
Yeah.
one,
And that would be an expense.
right. If we get a bunch of calls at once, well, it takes a week for each side to do, so you would need quite a few of those. And one thing to point out is in Northcrest is a good example. We got all those linear streets. If you put some on Dundee Street, they're going to move over. If it's a cut-through traffic situation, they're going to move over to the next one. So that's something that the speed hump policies and general discussions is be looking at what is the traffic going to do when you put some on this street. Are they going to shift to another street?
My first thought is it's good to have that option. And before you would measure the speed, I think you should measure how many cars go on the street. And if there weren't more than 500 cars, you wouldn't even measure the speed. But I think it's a good option for the cut-through streets. But I would really like to think about it before I commit to say that, you've presented it to us.
Right.
Give me some time my first thought is, yeah, it's a good idea, because there are a lot of cut-through streets that people use to avoid schools, to avoid all sorts of things, and they speed through neighborhoods. And my first impression, yeah, that would be a good idea. But like you said, for example, if you put it on Blythe Road, they'll use the next street over. So I need to think about it a little bit.
I was thinking maybe we could do it in combination with our pothole policy, and maybe on some of these streets not repair those potholes.
Call them speed sumps.
Well-
It worked well on Crestwood for a while.
There you go.
And Mr. Lofgren, I would say even if it pushes some of the traffic onto another road, you disperse some off that initial road as well.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
So,
I agree.
Yeah, I think I would be in favor of at least looking at a policy, as Mark's saying, to go through, okay, here's a potential policy, now let's talk about what some of these ramifications are. But if you have those parameters to kind of think through, I think that would help that evaluation
Right.
process to
Yes.
me.
Yes.
So would you like
Right.
time to think about what elements you want in a policy and then have a conversation about what elements to include? Or do you feel comfortable us incorporating these elements into a formal policy and then sharing that document with you and then discussing it after that?
No. I think you need to give us more time with all the ifs, ands, or buts that he's bringing up in order for us to evaluate if we even want to go down that road. I think,
Okay.
why waste time on a policy if there's going to be 1,000 ifs, ands, or buts, and then who, what, when, where, why? We need time to digest it, figure it out. I think you need to give us an opportunity to do this.
I agree.
All right.
Well, there are lots of people that are watching this tape, and so I'd encourage them to reach out to us also.
Yes.
Let us know what their
Exactly.
thoughts are.
That's a good idea.
I have an email from somebody on Greenwood specifically in regards to this.
Put them on hold.
See, and my thought was, I'd rather see a draft policy and to be able to really think through each step that may be required or what's required and see what works for Victoria and what doesn't.
Well, and either way, regardless of whether we put a draft together of one or not, ultimately, council either chooses to adopt it or not.
Right.
Sure.
So even going through the exercise of formally putting something together doesn't mean that, you're going to approve it.
Well, I think this is the first time that we're seeing this. I think we need time to digest it. That's all I'm saying.
I'm not asking for a policy to be placed on an agenda.
Okay.
I'm asking for a policy to be developed for speed humps and just given to all of us to look at and review.
Why don't
So that
we
we
put
can-
this on an agenda under items from council in a couple of weeks? And that'll give people a chance to think about it. And then in a couple of weeks, we can come to a consensus about drafting a policy that we can look at. It's still very slow in the process. But some people don't seem ready yet to have a policy written, although I am. But so what about putting it on an agenda in a couple of weeks for that discussion to continue?
Why can't we discuss a draft policy on the agenda?
Oh, well,
Items from council.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Other
but have a
items.
draft policy to actual
Oh.
discuss instead of just having
Well,
the
I
same
think-
discussion again on should we look at speed humps or not.
Because some people aren't quite ready for that yet.
I'd like to know all the ifs, ands, or buts that Gil is bringing up,
Which,
because some things I don't know anything about.
right, but you'll have that time. And it'll be in a policy that you can review and we can talk about.
True? All right.
I'm fine either way.
Well, y'all want to take a,
I'm for bringing forth a policy. We're not adopting anything, but we might as well have something to look at and actually digest.
Yeah, and I think, to me, like I said, I think the policy helps identify those if, ands, or buts, once we kind of see it laid out. So I'd like to see a policy to even start thinking further about it,
A
yeah.
draft policy.
A draft policy.
draft
Yes,
policy
a
on
draft
items
policy.
from council so that we can discuss it. And it's not a voting item.
Right.
Good.
And we can come to some type of
There you go.
consensus if we want to move
Right.
forward
That
and what
will work.
markups we'd want.
That will work.
That
And,
sounds
and
good.
we'll make sure that we send it out with plenty of time for you to review it
That would be great.
and not simply just wait until we post
Yeah.
the agenda.
Yes,
We can
please.
send it out a week before.
Yes, and I will have a time limit on the discussion so that we don't rat hole the entire meeting.
Are we going to get 2 minutes
Okay.
or 3 minutes?
All right, we got what we need then. Thank you.
3 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. Are there anybody else with items from council? All right, then we will close items from council and move into the work session?
Yes, so,
You got citizen communication.
oh, okay. Is it on the agenda?
It is.
It is.
I thought it wasn't, but that's all right.
All right, I will open the floor up for citizens' communication.
I don't know if you hear that in the back, but we are having a citizens communication portion to the meeting. I was incorrect earlier, I guess, when I mentioned to you. So if you'd like to come up to the podium, now would be the time. By the way, y'all are not going to go first anymore. Okay. Drainage master plan.
And thank you for coming to share with us, and if you would, in the interest
Is
of,
a microphone there?
There's 2.
Okay.
please limit your comments to 3 minutes.
See if one of them works.
Both work. Does that one work?
50-50 chance.
Hello? Hello? Oh, this one? It is. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I am Megan Driver, founder of Saving Animal Lives. I wanted to take some time to urge everyone to take careful consideration during this review time of the Animal Code. You are about to listen to presentations over various topics that have been carefully researched. Best practices and standards used in other cities will be discussed and how those practices can apply to the city of Victoria. One thing that was stated and became clear during the town hall workshop over the proposed animal code revisions is that very little research and consideration had been given to the code. The statement was made that other cities were not looked at and that they only looked at the city of Victoria. Imagine if that was the case given drainage, any master plan or development code. Would this council even consider passing such a revision? Animals are an important part of our lives and the community. I and many others have dedicated a good portion of our daily lives to helping animals. During this pandemic, many people have found bonds, formed very close bonds with their animals through this time. They have brought animals into their homes. They have not just become animals, but humans, more or less family to them. There are animals that are important to many of the citizens in Victoria. They are part of our everyday lives. Animals are important to people's mental health and well-being, so I hope everyone takes that into consideration when revising this and the seriousness that it deserves. Whatever this council moves forward with, my hope is that it is clear and provides citizens time to review what is proposed, and that the government transparency is provided to ensure citizens are aware of what will be adopted in the final format. It is important to take into consideration how these changes can and will impact the community. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mrs. Driver. Is there anybody else that would wish to address the council and citizens communication? Need a rear view mirror. Okay, this time we're going to close citizens communication, and I'm going to change up the work session just a little bit and have Mr. Goosh go first with item C3.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, members of council. The presentation this afternoon is going to be a overview of the feedback that we've gotten so far with regards to the changes in animal code with a list of recommendations. I want to start by saying it's not my goal today to present to you specific language that might be incorporated into a code, but rather to talk about the concepts that have been important to the people who came and to the town halls or to the or filled out the survey responses. And so this is going to be a conceptual discussion, and it's intended to generate feedback. So I hope that you will jump in at any time during this presentation to give me more information about what you want to see in the animal code as well. And then I do have a slide near the end of the presentation to specifically pause and ask for feedback that you might have heard from citizens, or that you might have concerns about yourself that you want to make sure gets included, even if it's not something that is brought up in one of the other slides. We've gotten quite a bit of feedback from the community on this animal code issue. You all know you've received numerous emails and phone calls yourselves, as have I. We also had over 80 people attend the 2 town hall meetings. They were held here in this room. I think they were very successful. We've had over 1,200 people respond to the online survey, and there were over 2,600 individualized comments typed into that survey. And so there is a significant amount of community information that we've been reviewing to try to reach this point today. I'm going to steal a slide from both of the town hall presentations that I used in order to clarify a point that I think we need to keep in our mind. And that's that the animal code is different from the animal control division of the county public health department. The code is a part of our code of ordinances. It's adopted by city council, and it establishes what the regulations are. Those regulations are then enforced in our municipal court. The animal control department is a department of the county. You all know that we share certain responsibilities, and I tried to make the point in the town hall that there are some city departments like fire and library that provide services additionally outside of the city limits to county residents. And also because of this shared relationship, there are some departments like the health department and animal control. I apologize, the font is a different font than I have on my computer. So when they move this over to a different computer, there may be other slides that are messed up. I hope not.
Unexcusable.
Inexcusable. I didn't know that we were going to be doing this off a computer other than mine. So anyway, The Animal Control Division is a county department. They are charged by state law with enforcing state animal codes, and also they enforce city animal codes within the city limits. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that topic with you, city council members, than I did at the town hall, because I want to specifically refresh your memory about the interlocal agreement and how it establishes that relationship. That agreement goes back to at least 1999. The current agreement was written in 99. I do not know historically whether there was a predecessor agreement before that. The 1999 agreement said the health department shall enforce state laws pertaining to animal control in the county and city ordinances pertaining to animal control in the city. And it established a cost-sharing mechanism to share those costs. I'm not going to dive deeply into the cost sharing because it's really not relevant to this discussion, but suffice it to say that costs were shared across all four of those departments based on a expenditure and population basis. It was a complicated structure that was put in place. And that's why in 2007 there was a new agreement that kept the responsibilities in place, but the agreement specifically says its purpose is to make simpler the accounting costs. And this is the agreement that's in place today. All of this that's on this slide is currently the same. The city is 100% responsible for the cost of the library, except for large capital expenses. The county is 100% responsible for the health department, animal control, county fire marshal, and airport fire department. And the two entities, the city and the county, share the fire service. It's an 85.5% on the city and 14.5% on the county split of that cost. The concept isn't just to balance the cost of the fire department, but the idea was that when you add all four of those departments together, it's intended to balance out the costs proportional to the population between the two governmental entities, okay?
Mr. Goosh?
Yes, sir.
While you're on this slide, and I know it's not really germane to your discussion, what's the definition of a large capital expense?
$100,000.
Thank you.
Anything over $100,000 should be discussed with the county in planning for those expenditures.
Keyword should.
Okay. The reason I'm taking some time to dive into that with you all is because there are a lot of comments that we received, and I'm sure that you received as well, about animal control and the way they run their operation and whether the community is satisfied with the way that operation is being run. And it is a correct answer to say our animal code doesn't address animal control. It's two separate things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot affect the operation of the Animal Control Division. Certainly under the current agreement with the county, it's 100% theirs, the responsibility is theirs, the drive is theirs. But if it is council's desire to have a more active role in the animal control process, this is where you would make that happen. We're not including that as a part of the code, and you'll hear me say repeatedly, we're not touching this particular issue because that's an animal control process issue. But I want to make sure that council members are have it at the front of their mind that it is possible to change this relationship. Just because we have had a shared relationship with the county for 23 years doesn't mean that that relationship is set in stone. It can be changed. Most of the next several slides are going to be dedicated to the responses that we got through the online survey. We asked 10 questions in the survey plus one. The 10 questions were based on the proposals that we had put in the original draft, as well as some known concerns that had come up, either in phone calls or emails or in other communication that we'd received. Each and every question allowed for an open-ended response. And so that's why you have 2,600 responses, even though there were only 1,200 participants. And the plus one question, question number 11, was, what else should we be talking about? What else should we be looking at? In case there were community concerns that we did not think to include in the survey. It was open for 2 weeks. We promoted that both through traditional and social media outlets, and I'm really pleased with the response we got. I think that the entire community had an opportunity to express their concerns. The next several slides will look similar to this. I'm going to show you a slide that has the bar graph directly out of SurveyMonkey that shows exactly what the results of the survey were. I've got some comments that I have pulled out and extrapolated from the individualized responses, and then I'm going to make a recommendation to you about how to handle that. I know the wording is very small. I'm going to try to read as much of that as I can. Question number 1 is, what should the maximum number of dogs or cats allowable in each residence? How many dogs or cats? And the options that we provided were 12, 10, 8, or 6. And then the big orange bar at the bottom is there should not be a cap. So I don't have my notes in front of me. I believe that was about 51% of the residents total said there should not be a cap. It was far and away the largest response. If you dig into the individual responses, that's the purple bar at the bottom. There were a lot of people that answered with a number, a specific number, and many of them were smaller than the smallest option that we gave them, which was 6. And so if you add up the 140 responses that people put in a number less than 6, that was about 11%. And so the idea that the idea of the cap, let's say, the vast majority of the population of the respondents to our survey were not interested in seeing a cap. But the largest percentage of people who are interested in a cap wanted to see a small one, not a big one. The other comments revolved around 2 different concepts. The idea that an arbitrary cap doesn't take into account the amount of space if you're talking about a Great Dane in an apartment was one of the examples. That's a very different situation than having several dogs out on a 2-acre lot in North Crest. An arbitrary cap, they say, also does not take into account the level of care being provided to those animals, that you can have a mistreated single animal family just as easily as you can have a mistreated multiple animal family. And so my recommendation is to delete this proposal entirely. I think the community spoke loud and clear that they are not in favor of us implementing a cap on the number of animals allowed in a single household. As I say, interrupt me at any time as I go through these slides. I'm going to go through each slide in about that format. Question number 2, what's the minimum number of days animal control should hold a stray animal before animal control becomes the full owner of the animal and is responsible for its disposition? Let me start by answering one of the questions I got. Does disposition mean destruction of the animal? And the answer is no. Animal control disposes of those animals either by the destruction or through an adoption agency. They have partnerships with Dorothy O'Connor, as well as Adopt a Pet and others, to try to make sure that animals have other options available to them. This is a question about time. There has to be a time at which the Animal Control Division becomes the owner of the animal and therefore has the legal right to make a decision about what to do with it. And so the question here is really asking about how long should they wait? And the answer is there. You can see the purple bar near the bottom is, I guess that's teal, is 5 business days. 5 business days was far and away the most common answer. If you dive into the orange comments, there were several people who said around 2 weeks. It was phrased either as 10 business days or 14 days or 2 weeks, but it's about 7% of the population. But the largest percentage of the population wanted there to be at least 1 week or 5 business days in order to ensure that there is time for the owner to try to reclaim that animal before it gets disposed of in some way. Yes, sir.
Is there a state regulation regarding anything like time limits?
I don't believe so.
Does the county currently have their own?
Does the county have their own regulation? No.
No, I just want to know because if an animal is picked up at the city versus the county, do there 2 different timelines that they're working on based upon an address where it's picked up at, and then they've got to manage that situation? Correct.
It's my understanding, our current code says 3 calendar days, or it just says 3 days, I think. No, it says 3 business days. Our proposal was 3 calendar days. And it's my understanding that they treat that as a minimum. They do not dispose of the animal immediately on that day. They continue to give an opportunity. But that's really a question more for them, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. So my recommendation here is that we move to 5 business days. And I do think we should call it out specifically as business days. There were a number of people who said if the Animal Control Division happens to be closed for an extended period of time, and that certainly could be possible even if we extend the time period to 5 because of hurricanes or whatever else. So I think business days is better than calendar days. Question number 3, how much money should animal control charge for a person to surrender an animal? The 2 largest bars there, the green bar at the top is it should be free, and the yellow bar is $25 per animal, but it should be free if that person is acting as a good Samaritan. If somebody has picked up a stray and they're dropping it off, that's different than someone surrendering their own pet. And I think it's pretty clear that there is a desire to allow that. I recognize that creates a definition issue. It creates an enforcement issue, if you want to call it. If somebody comes in and says, I picked this dog up off the side of the road, it's going to be hard to prove whether or not it's theirs or not. And that's a discussion I want to have with the Animal Control Division. But it's going to be my recommendation that we implement our code the way that that survey reflects.
Thomas, can I add something to that?
You can.
The last time this was discussed in any level of detail with council, I don't think it was made clear that the fees that were being recommended, the revenue for that is the county. And so it's important for you to note that in any conversation related to fees, all of this is money that is assessed and stays with the county.
What about the fines? Where do those go?
Well,
Fines, if you're talking about specifically municipal court fines, those stay with the city as, partially with the city, just as any other municipal court fine would.
Even though has to do with collecting, for the dogs?
If I think her question, if I can unpack it a little bit. So there's the municipal court related fees / fines, right? But
Right.
you're referring to
A fine for somebody?
to the non-municipal court related
Right.
fees and fines that they assess when something else happens.
Yes.
I would venture to say that those go straight to them because
Yeah.
unless it has a tie to municipal court, it doesn't come to us.
Let's keep our language clear here. A fee is money that is charged for us to do something, and all of the fees are going to be collected and maintained by the county. A fine is the result of criminal prosecution. That is a criminal penalty that is assessed after someone gets charged and convicted of a crime. And those would stay with the city.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I would just refresh my recollection, if you would. Is there currently a fee for dropping off that the county's charging?
No.
Okay, that's what I
Thank you.
thought. Okay.
Why would this need to be in the ordinance, and why wouldn't they just make it part of their policy?
That's my question.
Because they can't make policies. They can't make regulations. When you asked if the county had a regulation, they have to follow state regulations. Only the city can make regulations for the city.
He's correct.
The county can only follow what state.
So any county resident can come drop off animals and they don't get charged a fee. But if you're in the city, you do.
That would be correct.
I'd say strike this whole thing then.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the
So
question.
we're setting a fee up for the county.
No, we're setting
city
we're
residents.
setting a
City.
fee up for within the city limits that would
Correct.
be imposed and collected by the county. Correct.
So, yeah, straight.
Yep.
I'd recommend removing.
And keep in mind that when this proposal was first introduced to you by Thomas, it came with recommendations that came directly from animal control, right? And so they're the subject matter expert, for lack of a better term, on this issue because we don't run the operation, right? And so there's a certain level of dependency on our part on them to make recommendations to us on changes that make sense to them, right, and that have good rationale to them. And in their view, having the fee could indirectly potentially encourage somebody to not as easily surrender the pet, which of course creates all sorts of issues because then you can just drop it off on the street, around the corner. In Kingsville's case, it was actually the opposite. We had a fee and then ended up completely removing the fee because of the concern that we rather just have you drop them off than drop them off on the side of the road.
Yeah.
Well, did the idea of the fee come from a recommendation from animal control?
Yes.
And the reasoning was just to increase their budget
No,
or to be
they
able to?
said they said at one meeting I was at that it actually worked in other cities, and they thought it was a good idea. They didn't say it was for revenue, but that was their explanation. I don't know if there's more to it or not. I don't think there should be a fee.
Yeah.
I could see considering it if it was our department. It's not our department.
I don't think there ought to be a fee,
I think,
especially if the city and county residents are going to be treated differently.
Right.
I think there's
Makes
pretty
zero
clear
sense.
consensus around the table. If I bring you back a proposal with a fee in it, you're just going to amend it out at council meeting. So I'll just not include that in the draft that I bring back to you.
That'd be like if you're a county resident, you come to the library, you owe us money.
Yeah.
All right. This is a similar question, and you may very well have the same response here. This has to do with surrendering an entire litter of animals, and should there be a fee charged for that? In the proposal that Animal Control brought to us, they had a cap for a litter so that you wouldn't be charged $25 for each animal. So if you brought in a litter of 8 puppies, it would be capped at only $75 instead of the full $200, $25 times 8 animals. And here again, you see the same split we saw before, which is roughly half of the respondents saying it should be free, and roughly half of the respondents saying go ahead and charge, but make an exception for Good Samaritans. I expect there will be a similar response to this as there was to the last slide. Is that correct? That we just want to remove this fee as well?
That's
Yes.
correct.
If we
Be
don't remove
consistent,
this
but I
one-
could also, go ahead,
comment.
Scott.
I was just going to say, if we don't remove this one, they'll just bring them in one at a time.
But I could see this one, if you wanted to do it, you could do,
The comment.
$25 unless you've gotten the mother spayed. Because you're trying to achieve a goal, but.
I saw that comment a couple of times in the comments, but I think that that was something I was going to say was a really good idea if you have a fee. Of course, if you don't have the fee, then there's nothing to refund.
Right.
But it does allow for the opportunity to incentivize spaying the mother.
But my
So-
issue with the fee here is the same as it was
Yes, I
before.
know.
Is
Right.
city and county
Right.
residents are treated different. I
To
just
that
can't do
note,
that.
Makes sense.
just really briefly on that note, Tiffany, thank you. She's over there doing research, sitting in the back. But she sent me a link because the county does have a fee schedule related to the animal control operation. So they might not necessarily have,
Ordinance writing authority.
ordinances or any of that, but they do have impoundment fees, adoption fees, for example. And these are things that I assume, apply regardless of where the pet stems from.
Mhm.
Because regardless of whether that pet originates inside the city limits, there's still an adoption fee associated with that pet.
We're all
And the
county
county
residents.
keeps that money, right?
Do they have a
Agreed.
fee? Do they have a fee
Agreed.
for dropping off?
I don't see one.
Then they can make one.
Yeah,
That's what they
that's up
want.
to them.
They
Right,
don't have
which
to Put
is-
it in our ordinance.
I was.
Which is my point
Okay.
that they clearly do have the ability to have a fee schedule, amend it, change it as needed, and thus applicable across the entire county, the same way that their existing fees
Yes.
are, as opposed to it being embedded in
City code.
our ordinance.
Yep. Thank you, Tiffany.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany.
I was-
So sparkly too, thank you.
I'm not sure that,
Because they don't have
Yes, ma'am?
got around.
I'm not sure if we want to go this way, but it's just sort of in my head, is there any benefit of putting in a recommended donation? Not a requirement, but a recommended donation. And that's sort of coming from the discussion we've had about that the county can't do certain things. And I'm just kind of wondering if there would be any benefit of
That
putting
was a
that in.
comment. That was a comment that was repeatedly put in the survey responses, that it shouldn't be a fee, it should be a donation. That, however, is a question for animal control's operation.
Okay.
If we impose it, it's a fee. Even if we call it a donation, an optional fee is still a fee that we're establishing.
Okay, that's fine then. Let's not go down that road.
Okay. Question number 5. How many chickens should be allowed in a residence in the city? We asked this question specifically to open the question about chickens because we had numerous specific complaints about chickens in the months leading up to this proposal. And so that may be the most difficult bar graph to interpret. The green bar at the top is no chickens should be allowed, and then blue is no more than 5, yellow is no more than 10, teal is 25, and then the orange, of course, is other. And it looks like an even split among there. And so my takeaway from this graph is the top bar is 20% green. 20% of the population says chickens should not be allowed in the city. 80% of the respondents believe they should be allowed. And so I think it's important that we make sure that we continue to allow chickens within the community, subject to an appropriate regulation. Okay, and if you dive into the comments, there's a lot of comments about the regulations of fowl in general, including quail. I didn't know we had a quail problem in the city limits, but there were multiple comments about quail being included, and I think we can address that with a definition issue that quail are fowl and therefore covered. Most of the comments dealt with there being enough space for the chickens, or there being enough care of the chickens, that we shouldn't be worrying about what the number of chickens are, but rather whether the chickens are well maintained in order to make sure that there's not smell or noise associated with those chickens. And so what I'm proposing is taking the highest number response there, 10, the no more than 10 is the yellow bar, no more than 10 chickens. In the backyard only, that's to address a specific, very vocal series of complaints that we got in the months leading up to the proposal, and that we include regulations to enforce noise and smell issues related to fowl in the backyard. Any feedback on the fowl?
Thomas.
I'm sorry, go ahead,
Okay.
Ms. Solis.
What about the question about the ag exemption? Are we going to have any
That's
kind of
coming up.
exemptions for the ag?
That'll come up in a later question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so, but if we're going to have an exemption, shouldn't it be here because we're talking about fowl right now?
Yes,
Why would
ma'am.
it be in another question?
It's a separate question because that question involves more than just chickens. I'll get to that very soon and you'll see what I mean. But don't worry, right now we're just talking about concepts. Where that sentence, the exemption gets written in the code, is a different question. And yes, I will definitely need to include an exemption in this section that ties back to that, if we decide to have an exemption for children in agricultural education programs. Okay?
Well, I think it goes back to, I don't think a number's necessary if they're taking proper care, and we have in the regulation the spacing of chickens. Some people have a giant lot, some people have a small lot,
Yeah.
okay? The thing about them not being in the backyard, they need to not be visible from the street. That's the problem we have in Victoria. You can drive in a neighborhood and there's chickens right there. It wouldn't matter if they're in the backyard if you can see them.
Yes.
But I don't think there needs to be a limit. It's just like the dogs. Now, there could be space requirements that we put in the thing, but some people have a bigger lot than other people, and they could have more chickens.
That's correct.
Yeah,
And
I
let's
would-
be very clear, if we change the regulation, right now does not require chickens to be in the backyard, but requires a 100-foot setback. If you reduce the setback in order to allow the chickens into the backyard, understand you're not solving the problem as much as you are making a different group of people upset. And so rather than trying to eliminate the complaint, I want you to think about this question in terms of which of those options is better for the city as a whole, not for any one particular situation. Okay? And I've had this conversation with several of you offline, and that's the reason that I'm arriving at that conclusion. I think that there is support for the notion of chickens being confined to the backyard, out of sight of the street in front, and that means there must be a reduction in the minimum setback so that they can be moved to the backyard.
You know, in looking at, the responses, and if you go through and look at those choices, there wasn't a choice on there for no limit.
Agreed.
There was an other, but the number of people that responded to other that gave comments, the vast majority of them were no limit, which is kind of like a write-in vote, okay? If you get that many people on a write-in vote, I think maybe there's a little bit of bias in the question, because I think, this is my personal perception obviously, but I think more people may have checked no limit if that had been given as an option to them. I'd also say that I agree with Mark. I think from the standpoint that this doesn't strike me as any different than dogs in that
Right.
you can have any number of chickens and keep them healthy in an environment. I think we should be looking at environment, not numbers. I mean, that's what makes sense to me.
Well, I want to focus also on this question of backyard. I think I may not be hearing everybody correctly, but I'm thinking backyard means behind a wooden privacy fence, not visible. But backyard can be a backyard with chicken wire around it. So what are we talking about with backyard? Because if we're talking about chicken wire, it's still going to be visible from the street if it's a side,
No, I think they need to not be visible from the street.
not visible from the street.
But also, I think some minimum setbacks from property lines need to be put in there, just like we have minimum setbacks for houses.
The proposal that was brought to you before, I believe, said 5 feet from any side, any property line, in order to provide that space from the neighbor's yard. And I think it said 25 feet from another person's house. Okay.
How do you determine what noise or smell is what you want to enforce?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. It's done all the time in codes, though, where you state that standard that it shall not give rise to noxious odors, and then it becomes an issue for the courts to parse out. If that person has a noisy or smelly chicken coop and is cited for it, then that person has the opportunity to come to the judge and make the case that, you know, maybe the wind was blowing the wrong direction. It's not normally smelly. It's not normally a problem. There haven't been any community complaints, et cetera. It becomes a fact question that has to be parsed out in court. What I'm hearing consensus around is perhaps remove the up to 10, but the rest of this recommendation is probably going to be okay. And I think it'll be easier for you to make clear decisions when we bring back the text so that you're actually looking at it instead of just thinking about it conceptually.
Don't we have a limit right now?
Not in the total number of chickens. No, I don't believe we do. I think we only have a cap on the number of chickens in an agricultural program, not if you just are raising them for the joy of chickens.
Let me ask a question about not visible from the street.
Yes, ma'am.
Because I'm having a little bit of trouble worrying about putting things in the putting chickens in the backyard. If you're on a corner lot, and if you build a privacy fence that doesn't interfere with traffic sight and all that, then what difference does it make if they're on the side yard or the backyard?
That's a good point.
As long as they're not visible.
If they're not visible, then your neighbors would probably be happier if they were on the side. I mean, so I'm just having some problem with
That's a really good
requiring
point.
backyards.
That's a good point. Really good point.
I think you bring up a very good point, as well as I want to circle back to a point you made earlier that I don't know that everyone necessarily picked up on. Just to be clear, in certain parts of our community, it's not normal to have a screened fence backyard. And so if you say backyard, you're not necessarily having the chickens out of sight from the street. And so what I'm hearing you say is you would prefer it to say behind an enclosed screening fence or some similar language,
Right.
without concern whether it's in the front yard, backyard, or side yard.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm seeing nods around the table. I'll work on some language to bring back to you. This is the question about ag education. This is question 6. Should children in ag ed programs be allowed to raise animal for stock shows? I included the types of animals that we believe are allowed under those programs because I thought it was important for the community to know that might include cows, goats, rabbits, sheep, chickens, or turkeys. And I'll expose my own. I'm a city boy. I've got a city boy bias on this. I was raised in the city. I really thought that if I put goats and cows and sheep in that question, there would be a lot more no's on this list. But clearly the people in Victoria are okay with the idea of children in an agricultural education program raising cows and goats in the city limits. So I think this result speaks for itself. We should be allowing that carve-out exception, and I definitely do intend to bring that back.
Don't forget pigs.
We asked about what animals were allowed under the Ag Ed program, and pigs were not included on the list, although I think they are actually allowed as part of the Ag Ed program. We have pigs allowable in the city limits under certain limited circumstances already. And so I think it's important that we tie those two things together. But I think the way I'm going to write the exception is simply that a student who is in an agricultural education program being supervised by an instructor at, 4-H, I need to clarify that a little bit. They are exempted from these requirements, like the maximum number of chickens or the location and those other things.
As long as those animals are part of the program. I don't want it written that, I'm a student and I'm raising a rabbit, and so I've got 17 others.
Yes, ma'am. I think that's an important distinction. Question number 7, should owners of outdoor cats be required to spay or neuter their cats? Again, an answer that pretty much speaks for itself. The green bar is yes. There were numerous comments about whether that was enforceable, and I understand that is a legitimate concern. Nevertheless, I think it's pretty clear what our community wants to see happen, and we can talk with the Animal Control Division about how they would seek to enforce that. Question number 8, should dog owners be responsible when their dog attacks another animal? And the answer is yes. Now, some of the high-profile cases that you've heard about recently involve dogs attacking people. And dogs attacking people is covered under state law. It depends on the severity of the injury to the person, whether that's treated as a dangerous dog case or a severe bodily injury case, SBI. But that is handled under state law, and we do not include that in our code. This is a question about dogs attacking other animals, which is less strongly addressed in state law. And there has been some discussion before this code about trying to tighten up those regulations in order to make sure that that is being protected here in our community. And I think it's clear that the community wants to see that happen. The depends on circumstances comment, I think, is a definite concern. And again, as I answered previously, that's the kind of thing that would come up in the courtroom for the judge to consider all of the circumstances before any person was fined or penalized for their dog's conduct. Question 9. Should there be standards for restraining outdoor dogs, such as the length of the leash or shelter requirements? This is, again, an answer that pretty much speaks for itself. The green bar is yes. You'll remember when I came to you with the initial proposal, I said we were leaving in language that had been proposed at the state legislature, had passed the state legislature as Senate Bill 474, and then the governor had vetoed. We had asked Animal Control whether they wanted us to take it back out since it was vetoed and no longer state law, and they asked us to keep it back in, or to leave it in. And so we left that language in that would have codified what would have become law under Senate Bill 474. Since that time, we're now in our third called special session. The governor specifically asked the legislature to bring that bill back to him. The call for the third special session includes a bill substantially similar to Senate Bill 474. It's currently Senate Bill 5. It has passed the Senate. There's no reason to think it won't pass the House. It has before. I expect it will be going back to the governor and will become state law. Okay? This gives me an opportunity to talk about something else that's going to be different in the proposal that I bring back to you. You may remember me saying, it's normally my recommendation that we do not include state law provisions in our local code, because if state law changes, we might be out of sync. And that I also said I was going to make an exception in this case because Animal Control said they wanted all of the regulations in one document in order to make it easier for communication and education in the community. This process has convinced me that my original position was correct and I should have stuck to my guns. And when I come back to you with a revised ordinance, I am not going to be including provisions that are already included in state law. I think it's important that our community know what our local regulations are and what our city council has chosen to adopt locally, as opposed to our local comments being buried under a bunch of state law. So I'm gonna parse that back out, and that's gonna make the document probably significantly shorter than what you saw before. Question 10, how long should owners of outdoor dogs be allowed to leave their dogs unattended? I don't know why that's going black.
It'll come back. It's still up over here.
Okay. I can't read it from there.
There you go, it's back.
The green bar at the top is 24 hours, and blue is 2 days, yellow is 4 days. And so you can tell there's a desire here to cap the amount of time that dogs are allowed to be left unattended in the yard. Many of the comments here revolve around dogs being tied to trees in backyards, dogs being chained permanently outdoors. That's the theme that runs throughout the comments here. It also said we need a better definition of what it means to be unattended. I think that caused some people to not necessarily understand what this question was about, and I agree, we probably need to do that. If you look at the number of respondents that put in a time period in their comment that was less than 24 hours, like if we had included that response, it would have been 16%, which is, I think, more than the blue bar. I think that's about 10%. I have that in my notes as well. Clearly, there's a desire in our community for dogs not to be tied out. Now, there are also a lot of comments about state law already covers this, and there are some provisions in state law that apply to dogs being held overnight outdoors. Specifically, state law currently only deals with 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I think. It's an overnight window. And I think our community is looking for something broader. That will be covered, though, by Senate Bill 5 if it passes and is signed by the governor. The revisions to state law will make it much tighter. Finally, our bonus question. What other concerns should be addressed in the animal control ordinance? And there were a lot of there were over 700, I think 730 or 760 individual responses to this question. Enforcement of current laws, mandatory spay, neuter, and no backyard breeding. I didn't all caps that. That's the way it was written. Someone dumping an animal should pay a big fine. The city needs to mind their business when it comes to other people's possessions. Okay? There was a lot of information to digest reading through 700 plus comments. Here are some of the themes that came out of it, though. There were a lot of comments that revolved around the notion of better enforcement of the existing regulations. Typically, it'd be written along the lines of, before you start writing a bunch of new rules, make sure you're enforcing the ones that are already on the books. That's one of those things that it's an animal control operations issue more than it is a code issue. Animal control should be working with the rescues. We should work towards becoming a no-kill shelter. A lot of comments about no-kill shelters. Again, that's an operations issue, not necessarily something we would address in our ordinance. Stricter prevention of neglect of animals was something that came out. And I think that that is something that can be addressed and will be addressed in a lot of the things that we've already talked about, but is also tied to enforcement of what those restrictions are. And then penalizing irresponsible pet owners, not penalizing all pets. And Ruby Boone, the municipal prosecutor, and I have had a lot of conversations about a section of our code that's been in the code for a long time called Irresponsible Pet Owners, and put some additional burdens on someone once they've been deemed an irresponsible pet owner. And we want to tweak that section to treat it more like an escalation of penalties. So if you have prior offenses, perhaps you have stricter penalties attached to you as a way to try to address what this concern is. So we've got some ideas we're going to flesh out to bring back to you in that area. That's the survey, guys. That's a lot of information. I'm sorry that took quite a long time to go through. It's a good discussion to be having, though. I want to give you an opportunity to bring up anything that I might not have talked about yet.
There was one provision in there, Thomas, if I remember correctly, about an obligation if a citizen ran over a dog or ran over a cat to render aid. I had some concerns about maybe some ramifications of that And maybe, I would think we need to look at that a little bit closer in terms of obligating someone to get out in traffic and that sort of thing.
I agree with you. That's a case of unintended consequences, and we're definitely going to look back at that provision. The concern that we heard repeatedly in the town halls was, I don't want a little old lady to have to get out of her car and walk across traffic in order to check on the dog that she hit. All right? Yeah, that's a case of unintended consequences, and I think that's a valid concern we need to address.
Okay.
Not seeing any other comments, I don't want to waste a whole lot of time. Let me move forward. Just talking about the schedule as what's upcoming. At our next regular meeting on October 5th, I'll bring back to you the actual text of the ordinance. As I mentioned Tuesday night, that will be a new first reading. It's going to be a new draft. There will be a public hearing that night. That ordinance will be published ahead of time as a part of the packet for the community members to see and read, and hopefully they will come give us further feedback if there's still things that need to be addressed. On October 19th, we will have the second reading. Oh, let me back up to the question I have in the middle there. I wanted to ask you, do you council members want me to do a similar presentation to this going over the survey results at council? Is there a benefit of having that in a regular council meeting, or is that just going to be too much time?
I don't think it's necessary.
No, we've gotten the information here.
I think we've addressed everything.
Thank you. On October 19th, I'll bring back a second reading. I've been asked to split the second and third readings so that we actually have this on 3 meetings. So there will be a public hearing again on October 19th. And then the third and final reading will be on November 2nd. And my question for you is, do you want to have a third public hearing that night as well?
Typically, we do not have a public hearing for that, and I say we wait until after the second reading with the public hearing to determine whether we're going to have a public hearing with the third one.
I think that makes sense. If there are any additional changes between the second and third reading, it makes sense to give the public a chance to speak to those changes. Okay, great. And then typically our ordinances are effective 10 days after they're adopted, and so it would likely go into effect on November the 13th. All right? That's all I have for you today. I appreciate y'all's feedback, and I'll get back to work and bring y'all a document.
Thank you so much for doing those town halls again and working so hard on this. One question I have, is it possible to have a draft prior to the agenda being posted?
I'll get that draft out as soon as I can. And as soon as I have something ready, I'll share it with council. I don't know when exactly that will be, but I will get it to council as soon as I possibly can.
I know that didn't leave you much time.
We're working on a tight schedule, but yes.
But if it is possible, and is it possible to put that on the city's website?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, if it's possible to do.
We can make it happen.
Okay, thanks. With that, we're going to go back to C1, which is Drainage Master Plan Update by CivilTech Engineering of Houston.
Yeah, just really briefly, I want to introduce the folks. I want to introduce Melvin Spinks with CivilTech, and of course, everybody knows Ray. Everybody knows Ray. He doesn't need an introduction. But it's been a fun process for us working with them on the Drainage Master Plan. They'll walk through a little bit of history around it, but let's think back to when we first started this process and some of the elements that we discussed leading into it. And I'll start, really it's 3 big things, and they'll probably reiterate the points, but I think they're important. One, the fact that we have an existing drainage master plan with a ton of recommended projects that the city has not addressed, right? Second, you may recall we went through the redundancy study that looked at undeveloped parcels, and the big concept that came out of that was maybe it's worth looking at how to make parcels that are already inside the city limits, already have access to roads, already have access to water and sewer. Let's look at their developability as opposed to continuing to grow to the outskirts and just increasing our infrastructure expense and liability in the long term. And so that mindset was incorporated into this study, and so that's why they'll go over some recommendations that more intentionally look at making land that's already inside the city limits developable. And then third, there was a hard look at, for lack of a better term, maintenance component to it, because we recognize that having an adequate, manageable stormwater system is about more than just spending millions of dollars on, on a ditch and then millions of dollars on this other ditch, right? It's more than that. It's an ongoing thing, just the way that streets should be an ongoing thing. And so just keep that in mind as they go through their presentation, that those were the three big things that we wanted them to focus on as part of this process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Melvin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Garza. And Mayor Balknight, members of council, good afternoon. Thank you for allowing us to be here with you today. I was going to give a 5-minute introduction of Ray Bridges, but certainly y'all know him very well. But the cool part of this process was that CivilTech Engineering, a specialty water resources engineering firm, engaged in this process with the local engineering firm, Urban Engineering. Ray and I go back a long ways. I am a Victoria resident, born and raised here, so good to be back home doing a project in my backyard. But just let me give you a little bit of background on your storm drainage master plan. The study started in September of 2020. The scope of work, as Mr. Garza said, was a fairly defined, unique scope. It had several priorities. First, let me go over, it was, what's typical is project management and meetings such as these in a study process, data collection, which is your task B there. And then there were 5 priorities that the city asked us to look at. And today we're going to talk about those 5 priorities and the recommendations in those priorities. At your desktop there, we did put a copy of the presentation in front of you, along with our business cards. As we get through this presentation, feel free to ask any questions you may have. It is an engineering presentation, so bear with us. I'll try to keep it a little more entertaining for everyone. But let me recognize and also thank Ken Gill through this process, your Director of Public Works, working closely with us, and Mike Etienne also working with us. Let us thank them for their efforts. There are deliverables to this project. A lot of the technical work is in what we call memorandums. But one thing that's really important in the world that we work today is something called GIS, geospatial work. Today, you see a lot of your information on the city's GIS. And so one of the things we've tried to do in this process is really incorporate the master planning components into a livable study deliverable, which is the GIS system. So we'll talk more about that as well. As Mr. Garza had mentioned, he asked, let's take a little step back. Let's talk about what the city has in place in terms of your storm drainage master plan. Your current adopted master plan was developed in 1999. And there's 2 dates. It says 1999 and 2007. Okay, the 2007 piece to that master plan was really to update drainage criteria. But the process to actually the whole engineering product and the cost associated with that plan is in 1999. So the document is on file. It's referred to by the Department of Public Works as y'all implement projects. So what's the elements of the plan? And if you allow me, I'm going to go through this list here. But first, in that dark blue highlight area up on the top, it was really to develop recommendations for what we call the ultimate development of the city. That's a complete full build out. And so there was a series of projects that were identified to accommodate all that additional water from new development. It wasn't necessarily developed to solve existing problems, okay? But by implementing some of the projects, it would help to alleviate current projects. Within that plan, there are several elements. And as this comes back up, so 2 items in it were called regional detention ponds. One along the Longtree Creek, which it's called the Longtree Creek Facility, and that has been partially constructed. It's about 75% complete today. Much of that excavation of that basin has taken place through the Highway Department's excavation. And then there was another facility proposed along Spring Creek. northwest of Loop 463. Also, when you look into the plan, you're going to see several what we call open channel modifications, improvements along your major streams. And so the plan calls for widening, deepening in some cases, and several bridge and culvert replacements along creeks such as Whispering Creek, the North Outfall, US 77 Outfall, the West Outfall, Ben Jordan Outfall, South Outfall, Jim Branch Outfall, and Marcado Creek. Of all those priority improvements, there's been work on the West Outfall from Airline Road to Woodlawn Subdivision and along Lone Tree Creek between Houston Highway and Greenway Park Subdivision. Not a whole lot of those projects have been implemented today. And then what you also have in the plan is a series of many, many storm sewer improvements, which we call closed system improvements, where we're upgrading storm sewer pipe underground, adding parallel pipe to existing locations or replacing it entirely, and really to bring or upsize those pipe capacities to what we refer to as a 10 or 25-year storm. And then the last element of the plan is a pump station and bypass system called 2nd Street Outfall. If you pull up your plan, you'll see a drawing as shown on here, and this is directly out of your plan, that shows a priority of all those projects and also a cost. The cost that it's referred to in $1990 was $170 million. Updating those costs today, which we did, there's still a cost of about $293 million to implement your storm drainage master plan. There's a little note there that does not include right-of-way and easement acquisition cost. So that is your current storm drainage master plan. What you're hearing too today is something called Fema Floodplain maps. And there has been a relook at the floodplains in the city of Victoria. I want to point out something about the current floodplain maps with you. So the current regulatory maps that the city regulates off go back to 1987, 1998, and 1999. FEMA has been in the process of updating those maps and have reissued them as pending approval as of April 30th, 2020. One thing you should know is the data, the scientific data within that update is still based upon the science that was developed in the 1990s. The only thing FEMA is doing, and this applies to several communities, they're updating the topography for the area and remapping the same water levels, but on better topographic area information. It's called LIDAR today. So it does help communities at least have some better understanding, but still the science really goes back to the 90s in terms of hydrology and the hydraulics. So when you look at the information, there's really not a whole lot of differences between your 100-year floodplains along your major channels. So what I'd like to do is to take you through each of the tasks that we did for your project and give you a little bit of background on each of those tasks. But at this point, is there any questions before I get to each task element? Yes, ma'am.
I've got a question, and perhaps it's because I don't have the understanding that you do. But on this page before where it says no significant change to the 100-year or 1% floodplain limits along major channels, I take that as a good thing, and that the current drainage plan that we have in terms of development is working. Is that correct? That I think it's, I remember no net gain from a long time ago. I think that's still in there, and I'm taking that to mean that that we're on the right path. Yes, we need to build more capacity so that we can continue that no net gain, but am I making sense, or am I like, and if I'm way out, you can tell me so.
Well, definitely the city has made investments in drainage clearly over the years. Every time you build a roadway, you're making investments in drainage. There's been some implementation of your regional plan to accommodate new development, but very limited amount of that work has actually been done today. There does not appear to be significant floodplain water in people's homes in Victoria. Okay, even the drainage survey that I'll talk about in a few minutes didn't show that there is significant water in people's homes. Yes, there's nuisance drainage where we have our roads from time to time become impassable. But as all communities, and I'll answer it this way for you, certainly the investment in drainage and flood control is highly needed across many communities, including Victoria. You're doing a good job, but really the floodplain maps of yesterday are still of yesterday. The new maps, really the new science is not available today, because FEMA has not made that investment yet in Victoria. They're giving you new maps, but without new science. So once they give you new science, you're going to see more changes to your floodplain maps. And I'll give you another instance of why, because we're going to talk about changes in rainfall data information. What we know about rainfall today as engineers is a lot different than what we knew 30 years ago.
And we now know that the raindrops in Victoria are much larger, too.
Apparently so,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I do want to just add on to that, just for clarification's sake. It's important that when we think of the FEMA floodplain maps, we realize that those maps really only take into account, for the most part, the creeks and some of those natural flow areas. They don't look at your drainage system. Think about, we have streets that, one could argue have street flooding, right? Those don't come up in a FEMA floodplain because it may or may not have anything to do with overflow at a creek. And so it's important to just keep in mind that when FEMA looks at these floodplain maps, it's for the most part centered around the natural flow of the water once levels increase significantly down a river or down a creek or something to that extent, but don't necessarily take into account an entire drainage system throughout the entire city.
Yeah. And we're going to show you a picture of your real flood risk here in a minute in Victoria.
The presentations are intentionally there to cause some breaks. Give us time to breathe.
Yeah.
Well, while we're having that break, I know you said that in jest about our raindrops being bigger, but just for the record and for people watching, that was said totally in jest, right? There was no scientific basis for your statement.
No, I think there was. I think there was legitimate scientific data that backed up the thought that that's part of the reason why sometimes when we have broadband or other connections that are just point to point, that when you have bigger raindrops, it interferes more than when you have smaller raindrops. Apparently, it's a real thing. So we say it joking because it is funny, but apparently it is based off of some data somewhere. Is that correct, Eric? Yep.
Compared to where?
I don't know, but
place with smaller
but
drops.
after Derek told me, I was
Smaller
driving
drops.
down the street and it started raining, and I saw those raindrops hit the windshield, and I thought, OMG, these are the biggest raindrops I've seen in my life. So it must be accurate.
Very good. We'll keep, so we'll go on to the description of each of the task here items. So just for council's understanding, several meetings have been held on this effort. We've had 3 stakeholder meetings, December 22nd, 2020. It was followed up because of being so close in the Christmas time to another meeting on January 12th, 2021, and then here recently on September 17 to take input from various stakeholders, as well as having several coordination meetings, weekly in many cases and bi-monthly with the city staff as well. One of the things that was conducted by the City of Victoria was a drainage master plan survey. There were approximately 40 to 45 responses to that survey, so definitely not statistically significant in order to draw any conclusions on, but at least some indicators that came out of that survey is that 65% of the respondents rate that high importance to reduce street flooding within the city. 59% of the survey respondents rate high importance to improving the major drainage outfalls to reduce the 100-year floodplain limits. Of interest, 90% of the survey respondents had not flooded before in their homes or businesses in the past 15 years. And then less than 20% of the survey respondents do not have flood insurance. Task B is the data collection and review process. A lot of what happens in the engineering world is you have to go back in time and look at the data that's been created. We spent quite a bit of time with your previous master drainage plan. One of the things that we've acknowledged as we start working on it is that many things that we have to have are hydrologic and hydraulic models to make predictions, simulations, and those models go back 20 years and they're pretty outdated. So we didn't have the ability to run those models to look at any significant scenarios. But again, that will be a recommendation as we get to the end of this presentation. And also the land use that was looked at when those models were developed go back to 1997, quite a ways back. In the PDF presentation, and I believe Council probably has received a copy of that, you can hit the hyperlink on that and you will go to the online GIS platform that's currently run under our website, CivilTech Engineering. That will eventually be transferred over to the city's GIS, and they'll have that ability to run those layers. And certainly if we had time, we could look at those as well. But we created 17 new GIS data layers, which add to some that go back to the 2007 that are on there. The first priority that the city asked us to look at was to look at undeveloped parcels and look at the potential for development of those parcels. If I can recall correctly, there were a little over 245 parcels in the city that were undeveloped, representing about 4,000 acres. And we were able to look at 45, representing about 1,350 acres of undeveloped land in the city. Shown on the right side there is the location of all the parcels that we looked at, ranging from a 2-acre up to several hundred acres inside. As part of the engineering effort, the city asked us to look at what development constraints in terms of drainage would be on those parcels. And so we developed 28 development constraint maps to those, so that would aid the city, Public Works, in understanding what the drainage issues would be, as well as the developer to, when they look at these developments, to be able to understand how to incorporate better drainage in the future. With those, we were also able to develop 5 regional drainage solutions in order to, where city participation would be needed in order to help development progress on these tracks. And those solutions that we looked at were channel improvements, storm sewer improvements, and where easements are needed. I'm going to ask Ray to talk to you about those 5 regional plans.
Thank you, Melvin. Can y'all read that up there? I can't. I think I picked. I can't see anything. I'm going to have to use my note. So as Melvin explained, we selected 45 undeveloped infill parcels within the city and performed a pre-development drainage analysis on each. The green figures are the parcels that we looked at. We utilized all of the city's existing GIS data along with, combined it with all of the new data that was generated by this study to evaluate the development potential of each of these sites. And what we found was that 17 of the studied parcels had no access to an adequate drainage outfall that is necessary for proper development. And we found that 12 of the parcels had moderate to severe floodplain issues. We then searched for drainage solutions for each of the difficult tracks and came up with 5 regional projects that would improve the development potential of 23 of the infill parcels that we studied. These 5 projects would also improve drainage for other undeveloped and some developed tracks within the 5 general regions. I'm going to briefly go through each one of the proposed 5 projects. Keep hitting the wrong button. The first of the projects is just outside of Loop 463 between Salem Road and Mockingbird. It's on the Schlein property. And it's a very old problem. This problem was created in the 1980s when Loop 463 was first constructed. And the master drainage plan at the time, which would be the 1978 plan, had designated that this property in this area, about 100 acres, would drain under Loop 463 on Lone Tree Creek. But when the loop was constructed, the highway department took advantage of an existing rice canal and drained this 100 acres under the loop at this location. The problem with that is that Meadow Creek subdivision had been constructed 10 years prior, and now the water, and since that time, runs through the loop here and then through Meadow Creek subdivision through here. I didn't know I was going to have a pointer. I described where it goes, but it ends up in Lone Tree Creek right about here at the East High School. Gets to the same place, but the system through this subdivision was not designed to take this acreage through it. So as this area develops, it's going to get nothing but worse. What we proposed was a diversion channel that would cut off the flow from this, get it over to Lone Tree Creek where it belongs and out of the middle of this subdivision. Yes, Hayes?
Oh, I was just gonna, for point of reference, do y'all capture where this is located?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's recognizable to most of us. There are going to be some that probably aren't. I'll go slower on trying to get everybody oriented as to where you are.
What does that mean?
Young Tile, Rinkin's Nursery, and the 3 Easter Island statues. Right.
But currently, up at the north part of that map,
Dealership.
there's a dealership.
Yeah.
The new dealership is on,
This is a dealership.
right.
That's
This
correct.
is a
So
dealership.
what does that do to everything?
They
The
built a big
dealership,
They've got a
that's a
retention
long,
pond.
that's a long story, but the dealership drains,
Okay.
well, it drains to Salem Road. But it's one of the victims, the dealership property is one of the victims of not having things like this in your plan. The dealership got cut off from its natural drainage way, which was through the large church at Salem and John Stockbauer. That's it, that's its natural drainage direction, and because there was no plan that gave the city the ability to demand the easement, it kind of got its ability to drain that way cut off. So we had to go another way. And in order to go the other way, which was not sized for us, we had to talk with the TxDOT and cut our flows back tremendously. That entire dealership is drained with 2 12-inch pipes.
Which is why it has a large,
That's why
super
it's got-
large
Then
detention.
because it would take it 8 days to drain dry, we sized that pond for 2 back-to-back 100-year storms.
Thank you.
pretty full one day.
And when you say that your situation here drains through that subdivision, you're not referring to it draining underground. You're saying that it overflows into the streets and such in the subdivision. The
Yes.
nuisance drainage is, I love that.
Yes. most of our talk is going to be about drainage above ground and in situations when what is underground doesn't function properly. That's the real threat of being flooded that you're going to hear all through this program. Is the real threat is when you exceed the underground system and it starts going back to where Mother Nature intended it to go, and you've got something built in the way. So that's the problem of that one. This little fix, we need an easement and about $280,000 to divert that flow. Don't get excited about the low price tag because the rest of them aren't that nice. Number B, we gave them letters so we wouldn't have numbers. B is a little bit harder to find. This is Shenandoah subdivision, and this is the green belt that runs through Shenandoah. This is Guy Grant Road, and this is Lone Tree Creek coming down. East High School again. This is downstream of this location. So under normal circumstances, Shenandoah Ditch functions pretty adequately. I personally have never seen it causing a problem. However, this ditch is responsible for draining quite a bit an area from Guy Grant Road up to around Will Hurd. This is John Stockbauer. It drains this area and there. It's got a fairly large area it's got to handle with quite a bit of undeveloped property. The reason that property is undeveloped is they don't have an outfall. They don't have a ditch that runs up in there that's deep enough for them to do anything with. But what the overland flow analysis that we did as part of this study, which Melvin will get to in a moment, indicates that there's a larger lurking problem, and that is the 100 acres north of the loop plus everything from Loop 463 to Guy Grant Road would rather come down that old Rice Canal spillway, Rice Canal, and go through this area. Once I started looking more closely at what had been done in here, if the storm sewer in this subdivision doesn't take the water and the storm sewer in John Stockbauer doesn't pick up this water, the downhill tendency is for it to end up at Shenandoah Ditch. So this is the route and the proposal that we have in our plan to aid in the event of that, plus also provide better drainage for this area in here at a cost of about $3.8 million. Project C. Project C, this is East Rio Grande, Delmar Drive, Lone Tree Road, and Anthony Road. Yeah.
And that's Lone Tree Acres.
This is Lone Tree Acres subdivision. We've got two projects in this area, but this one is a 72-inch storm sewer pipe to drain from Anthony Road to Lone Tree Creek. If you know Victoria, you know there's already a 72-inch storm sewer pipe there, and yes, we are proposing a second one. This piece of property is the one that's suffering from not having an adequate outfall to Lone Tree Creek. The estimate for this project is $1.57 million.
And would it just fix the place you're pointing to? The other two lots are okay the way they are?
It's the whole block, if we can call it a block. It's the whole. It's not just the bold tracks.
Right.
Also the James Wayne property on the left would benefit from it.
The underground storm sewer, this current 72-inch pipe that's in here drains this portion of this subdivision, drains all of this property and up to about here through a 72. It's just not large enough, and I might as well say it, this landowner did not allow him to put in an open ditch at the time. Putting in an open ditch would still be the best way. And now I'm going to take a short segue on open ditches. Underground pipes are prettier. Everybody loves them. But they don't have the reserve capacity that an open ditch has. If you double the amount of water in a ditch, the water goes up about 2 feet. If you double the amount of water in a pipe, it won't go in. You can't get it inside the pipe. for it to do. Ditches are a lot more forgiving when the big rain really hits.
Mr. Garza, is that the property that belongs to the nuns?
This one is.
The one where the easement would
Right.
go through, or does go through, yes.
Okay.
And then the area that it would help is an area that we've discussed, because in the past there has been interest in development in that area, but drainage was always a concern.
Right, on Hike and whatever those other streets are back there? Off of
This-
Lone Tree?
This is almost the same area. Here's Lone Tree Acres again. This is the piece we just talked about. That's where the 72 was. So just downstream of that, we're trying to pick up this area. And this area has a very limited drainage system at the current time. This section that runs through where the Lone Tree Drive-In movie theater was is an existing channel, but this ditch system doesn't exist, and this ditch system doesn't exist. And the benefited parcels from installing these sets of improvements would be all of this area. We're interested, I personally, as a citizen here, I'm interested in, since the state put an overpass at Hanselman Road, I think that this area is going to get a lot of interest really soon. And they have absolutely no way to drain without buying an easement through this person.
And as you can tell, I'm sorry.
Good enough.
I was just going to say, and as you can tell, this is an area that we've been talking about, right? Lone Tree Acres. And when we had the CIP conversation, we said, you know what, we want to take our time in figuring out the Lone Tree Acres drainage and street improvement. Part of it was because of this, because we knew this was coming. We knew a much larger conversation was coming about potential drainage improvements in the area, that we did not want to expend, the funds and just looking at Lone Tree Acres, the residential piece by itself, and solving that, and potentially missing an opportunity to do a much larger drainage improvement that not only benefits the neighborhood, as council has directed us as part of the CIP, but also potentially make some land developable for future development. And so that's why.
Okay, right now we're having the presentations as A, B, C, and D. We get to categorize them later in priority fashion once we decide where we're going to go?
Yes, at some point. Yeah, great question. And so what we envision doing is, as you already can get a sense of, right, with the downtown master plan presentation, this one, and then the parks, and and everything else, is that once you add all of that together, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, right, of work that we need to kind of filter through. So our objective is to, once we get through all of the master plans, because in our mind it's not just about one, is we want to, as staff, narrow it down to maybe 5 to 10 projects in each of those, right? So visualize 5 to 10 projects for drainage, 5 and 10 projects for downtown, 5 to 10 projects for parks, to then be able to have a more feasible conversation with you about how do you want to prioritize these projects within their respective category, and then ultimately how do you then want to prioritize them against each other. And we believe that would be a more realistic conversation with you than expecting each of you to wrap your head around 5 different master plans and every single component of it, right? We see our role as the professionals that you hire as we provide the information, we educate you as much as we can, but then we would make a recommendation on the projects, right? And then ultimately, yes, it would be up to you to rank them at level of priority.
Can you kind of talk about the interplay between this project and the one just before it? Because they're all draining the same area, and can we get more bang from the buck if we fix one of those? Will it somehow help the other?
And feel free to interject with the work that you're doing with the neighborhood piece too.
Yeah, I'm currently, backed up. I keep hitting wrong.
So that one was
This is a 72-inch pipe.
Right.
And I'm more interested in this one. This is this portion of the solution is, I have a contract to solve these people's flooding problem. So I've been working in this area for a while. I also had a previous contract to work on development of that piece of property and had to tell him, we don't have a way to get there without the assistance of the city. And that's kind of the common theme. These people can't help themselves. This one because it's an existing subdivision, the other because they don't have the power of condemnation or the ability to go to other pieces of property and get easements. They're drainage locked. We know the existing system is overloaded and we need to find solutions. So these two solutions of spreading this drainage out, taking this into the creek here, is the best way for this property by itself to gain access for drainage. And this solution is the best for this area. There's a hill right in here that you're not seeing. Well, you can't see it, but there's a ridge in here. This portion of this property goes this way. This portion of it goes back this way. So there's a natural divide in there and also breaking it into bite-sized pieces. But yeah, I'm working on this, and that is a very possible solution for this drainage up here.
So, for example, if we were to only try and solve the existing issue that's already approved and we already have some money for, which is for the neighborhood, that easement wouldn't go all the way down the way that he's showing it now.
Yeah, it would start right there and go right there.
And that's it, because that's the only part of the project that's been approved. But as you can see with this, if you keep going, and then cut
if we
across.
go this way, we're opening up the door to get this in, and this isn't a new concept for anybody. This was mentioned in the 78 plan. It was a little bit different on their routing. They came straight through the middle, but this is basically what the 78 plan suggested.
Was that helpful?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
We're coming up on 3 o'clock. We still have at least the parks plan coming up as well. Want to make sure we have adequate time to get through both, or let's just get through one. But
I think we can get through this in the next, 20 minutes?
30.
Maybe 30 minutes?
But
maybe?
I'll make it fast. Last project.
And then we can just take it from there.
Community center, Old Stroman campus. There's no drainage coming out this way. These tracks almost up here on the highway, these tracks were brought to my attention because they're for sale. And I said, they've got to drain this away. It's downhill and downhill a lot. And we have no easements to get here. This person can't do it by themselves. And that's a common thread that we have on a lot of these projects. Back to Melvin.
All right, Melvin, you heard the man. Got to run through it quick.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ray. You took all my time, but it's clearly very important. So as we progress through the study, this next is really looking at the city's current drainage criteria manual and what updates would be necessary based on really new information. And what has happened different today is that Texas, the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is part of the National Weather Service, adopted new rainfall, the big drops of rainfall. And what the last rainfall data we had goes back to the 70s that us engineers worked off. And in this table, what you see is that you'll see on the left-hand side is a storm event, 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, 25, 50, 100, and 500. And on the right-hand side, you'll see what that current means. That's what your community currently uses. And then what's being proposed today is something called Atlas 14. That's the new NOAA information. Most communities across Texas has adopted this new rainfall for the design of storm sewers and open ditches. And when you look at this new data, what you're seeing is that if you look at what's highlighted here, NOAA, our government says for the city of Victoria, a 100-year storm is not 11.5 inches in 24 hours. It's actually 13.4 inches in 24 hours, about a 1.9 inch difference. Other communities across the coast have also seen higher rainfall for their community. But what you also see here that's interesting, everything in underground, your storm sewers are designed really for this 5-year and 10-year event, and that's also very common. The rainfall really hasn't changed that much. There's very little difference in that rainfall. So we're asking, we provided this information to the city, to Ken Gill, to take a look at adopting these higher standards for development using or for capital improvement projects. Also in the drainage criteria manual, there are some requests that are going to be looked at. For the most part, everything in dark here on this graph, and this is really design criteria. How do you design your streets? How do you design for what storm frequencies? And we're really not asking or suggesting any improvements to that criteria, but what we are asking, because of this 100-year rainfall being different and the detention, is that the city should adopt a permanent detention requirement. Okay, right now, all developers really do put detention in, but it's because your criteria says temporary. If you haven't built your channels yet, then you would only need to provide temporary detention. And the reality to that is that most communities are really going to require permanent detention. And so we have provided information for the city that says, kind of remove the temporary detention, have permanent detention for the development community, clearly raise a developer engineer. This really doesn't change what's going on today from all practicality, but there would be some exemptions that'd be looked at. Those exemptions are here listed. Redevelopment, which are remodels in addition, would only require detention for any increase in impervious cover. 2 is that development that's 1 acre or less with less than 65% impervious cover would be exempt. Anything above 65% impervious would be detained for on 1 acre or less. A lot of communities are going to green infrastructure. They're recognizing the importance of what we call low density development. And so there would be an exemption for any parcel that has less than 20% impervious cover to be exempt. And then clearly any properties that drain to the Guadalupe River or to the lower reaches of Spring Creek would also be exempt from detention. We would also recommend, we ran several calculations that to keep the playing field equal, the city Public Works needs a storage rate, what we call it, so the developers understand that this rate is the minimum amount of detention storage you would need based on the percent impervious cover, and that way when information's coming into the city for review, they're able to check it against this particular curve that the engineer or the developer met the minimum requirements on detention.
I have a quick question on impervious cover and talking about low density. I'm picturing a solar panel farm field. Is that impervious cover or not? And I'm just going to throw that out there. That may be something to think about because I'm seeing water pouring off.
So
you don't have to
I'd
answer
have
that.
to
It's
see
just a thought.
specifically what you're referring to, but typically that's ground cover. So concrete is impervious.
Right.
Gravel. So there's a definition.
Yeah, there's
impervious.
definitely grass underneath, but then you've got wall-to-wall solar panels.
Right. That's certainly something that has to probably be looked at. Okay, so we'll go to our priority 3, which is a storm sewer evaluation. So we did do quite a bit of technical work in re-looking at the surface drainage across the city. So I won't belabor this, but there is a two-dimensional model that we ran to take the rainfall that we talked about in the previous slide, drop it on the city, and determine how that would affect the flood risk. And so, as Mr. Garza had pointed out to you, that the FEMA maps give you a flood risk related to your major channels, your big floodplains, but the real flood threat exists throughout the city in terms of when your underground systems are surcharged, as we say, they're overloaded with the higher rainfall, then your surface must take that water and convey it to your outfall channels. And this is an example of a 2D analysis. This is by the University of Houston. And as you can see, the subdivision, Ray, help me on the name here.
Which one?
Okay, Red River Heights. Many of you may have seen that there's been some historical drainage issues within that subdivision. So our analysis can kind of pinpoint when you get a heavy rainfall like 100-year of what the surface flooding may be. So these colors represent depths in the model analysis. So clearly roads do carry, whenever you have an extreme event, your roadways do act as drainage pathways. So don't be too alarmed to see water on the roads in these pictures. What we like not to see is the reds or water on parcels. So this particular slide shows the FEMA floodplains within the city of Victoria. Here's 59 coming in. The mall area over here. The big floodplain is clearly the Guadalupe River. That's the FEMA mapping. This is the Lone Tree Creek floodplain. So FEMA tells you this is your flood risk to your community. The real flood risk is when you run a two-dimensional model with 13 inches of rainfall. You will see that the potential flood risk is much higher when you really look at a complete model analysis, which we have. And this is very helpful for the developers and the engineers to look at how to better drain subdivisions to key locations with that may have had ponding problems. Priority 3 was really to take a look at your storm sewers and classify them. Many of the city storm sewers that were built years ago have a certain level of service that we looked at. Much of the city has less than a 2-year capacity for their storm sewers to drain water. The current design requirement is that the city systems have at least a 5-year. So all your new subdivisions do have 5-year level of service, but a lot, again, not unusual. Rainfall was a lot different when those things were designed back in whether it was the 30s or 40s. But as these systems get replaced, they'll be upgraded to higher standards. One of the things the city asked us to look at is to give them a distribution of pipe sizes. On the left-hand side of this table shows the miles of pipe. There's over close to 30 miles of less than 18-inch pipe underground within the city. Would be classified as substandard because your minimum pipe size underground today is 18 inches. And then the distribution ranges from a 24-inch pipe with 44 miles up to, in this case, a 60-inch pipe, which is far less in terms of the length of pipe. But you got about close to 196 miles of storm sewer pipe under the city. The cost to replace, if you were to replace everything under 18 inches, that's your 10-inch pipe, your 12-inch pipe, your 15-inch pipe, you're looking at a cost of about $39.5 million just to bring that pipe up to standards. We're not recommending you do go and replace that pipe. We just want you to understand what the cost. That pipe will eventually be replaced with roadway projects in the future. But there may be some areas within the city of Victoria that would warrant some replacement of pipe. Televising is, oops, sorry. Mr. Garza mentioned to us that we're going to be looking at maintenance items. It's been a long time, or maybe never, that the city has actually televised storm sewers and cleaned them. Unlike where you clean and televise your wastewater, your sanitary sewers, the storm sewers have not been televised or cleaned. You got about 166 miles that we had at least looked at for possibly televising cleaning. If you were to do that whole program today, you're looking at a cost of about $16.6 million to televise and clean sewers. One of the first items you have in your database today that you did have is all the roadside ditches within the city. Clearly, not only do you have storm sewers that drain water, but you have a lot of roadside ditches within the city. These ditches, you have about 114 miles of ditches. If you were to have a program to regrade, that means dig out these ditches, you're looking at about a $15 million cost. You have about 16 miles of driveways, or over 3,000 driveway culverts associated with that. If over time, if you were looking to replace those driveways, you would be talking about $43 million of cost. And then with that, we took a look physically, went out to and drove the city, and we identified really what needed to be done today, and we're calling those priorities. So we found 23 miles of roadside ditches today that could be cleaned in terms of regraded at a cost of about $3 million. That includes 669 culverts that should be replaced, and that would cost somewhere around $8.7 million for a total cost of $11.6 million.
And can you go back real quick?
Yes.
So those are the areas there that I guess in the screen they look what? Pink? Those are the areas that are priority areas. So you can tell that the majority of them are, south of Business 59. So they're just in the older parts of town.
Also, your major outfalls should be maintained regularly. We did take a visit. We did a drone of all major outfalls, all your major creeks we looked at. There's about 74 miles of open ditches, major channels. Of those 74, about 19 miles is concrete lined. And when you look at it, we identified not a whole lot of concrete failure today, so that's a really good thing. But there are significant, or a few areas, and I think we identified about 33,000 square feet of areas, representing costs of about $1.3 million to repair. There are several channels where there's some erosion that could be repaired as well at a cost of $591,000. And then there are channels where sediments have built up in locations due to the erosion, and that cost would be about $908,000. So in summary, this update was to provide you several recommendations through these priorities. As Ray went through the priority one with you, if you were to upgrade or build the 5 regional drainage solutions, you would be looking at a cost of about $13.3 million. That, again, it would exclude right-of-way and easement acquisition cost. If you're looking at storm sewer evaluations, if you're going to go replace all under 18-inch diameter pipe and do all the televising, you'd be at a cost of $56 million. Priority 4 is your roadside open ditches to go regrade those and replace driveway culverts, talking about a cost of about 11.7 million. And then your major outfalls, doing those repairs. And again, those will just be what we know today, and certainly in the future there will be added costs to those as well. So 2.7. I mean, when you start adding up infrastructure, it's extremely expensive. So you had a $293 million storm drainage master plan of projects. This would be an additional $83.8 million of needs for drainage. Clearly, not all of that is a priority maybe for day one, but here are some recommendations we have for you. Recommendation number 1 is that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, everything in your current master drainage plan is over 20 years dated. And so there is some time and attention that we believe should be spent for Jim Branch and Marcado Creek because of some potential development pressures in those watersheds. So we would ask that you further do some restudies to better define better drainage solutions, more regional drainage solutions. The cost to planning those types is around $400,000 per watershed. There are grant funds potentially from the Texas Water Development Board that could be looked at to go solicit some funds for that. The second recommendation is a drainage maintenance program where the city would be establishing a drainage maintenance annual program for cleaning storm sewers, pipes, manholes, inlets, and would also include cleaning and regrading roadside ditches as we identified the priority ditches. The estimated cost to that annual program today is about $28.3 million. The city may consider putting together a stormwater drainage utility fee for funding that type of drainage maintenance program. Recommendation number 3 is to repair the channel erosions and also do a cleaning program on your major outfalls, again to correct existing concrete line failures or erosion or sediment deposits. That's again what we found today would be about 2.8 million, but there will be an ongoing program as well to continue to look at channels, particularly after any major storm event. Funding could come through the city's capital improvement program or through a drainage utility fee if that was a consideration. Recommendation 4 is that you do adopt the 5 regional drainage solutions that Ray presented to you. With that, they'll be able to look at those future improvements, which we had already talked about the cost being around $13 million. We are recommending the adoption of the new NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall data in the City of Houston's criteria manual, as well as making detention a permanent requirement for the city. And last but not least is one thing when we were working with the city is really collecting and maintaining data. It's very important for going after future funding that the city look at. So how do you monitor data? How do you keep it up? And making some investment to keeping up that information and data. I think that was about hopefully 15 minutes, but I didn't want to rush through, but I'll open it up for questions.
I have one question. Is Drainage District 3, do they have any responsibility for drainage other than mowing ditches?
Just mowing.
And Ken, you may want to answer this question, but I believe maintenance is their primary responsibility.
Drainage District 3, Ken, that was the question.
Yeah.
There's primary responsibility is Lone Tree Creek.
Right.
And they do get up into the city. We've worked with them, but it's primarily Lone Tree Creek and a little bit of Marcado, but nothing else. That's their district boundary.
Well, it goes all the way up to Plasto Benavides, according to the map.
It does. And we work with them to do the heavy cleaning and some of the mowing parts. We have worked with them. We need to get back with them to build up that relationship and come up with an agreement as far as how they can help us inside the city.
Okay, well, as you can tell, there's a lot to unpack there, a lot of information, and hopefully you can start getting a feel for the differences between capital expenditures and those things that might be maintenance, because where we foresee going from here is having a obviously follow-up conversation after you have time to digest it more and review it, to really seek some direction, because we would want to know, for example, are you interested in a stormwater fee utility or not, right? If the answer is yes, then we would do a separate study with a separate consultant to help us figure out what that would look like, what that would be. But in order for us to even go through that process, we would need to fine-tune what we want to take on from a maintenance standpoint, so they can just have all the information as part of that study. We went through that in Kingsville, so very familiar with that process. Of course, the incorporation of projects into the CIP, that'll obviously necessitate a conversation with you as well. And so we will be looking for direction on those fronts. This plan, consistent with other master plans, will formally come to you for approval at an upcoming council meeting. And so we just need to coordinate with you on when the timing is right for you to feel comfortable adopting the drainage master plan. If history tells us anything, it tells us that, we can have an adopted drainage master plan and do nothing. And so don't feel that adopting the drainage master plan all of a sudden, commits us to doing everything by a certain period of time. But it does update some important matters as they talked about, especially with the drainage criteria manual. So just review it, and we can talk about it in our one-on-ones in more detail.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Melvin.
And welcome home.
You want to take a break? You want to keep going?
Does anybody need a 5-minute break? All right, 5-minute break, so we'll break. Be in recess for 5 minutes. The meeting back into order. Thank you, Ms. Scott.
Welcome back.
All right, we're on
right.
to item C2.
Okay. What else is going on?
All right, so next up is another update on another master plan. This one related to parks. Unlike the drainage, you've already had a chance in the past to receive an update on parks, so hopefully that leads to a tad quicker overview of the plan. It's not your first time viewing it. And of course, it's not your first time hearing from Christian Lent, so I'll turn it over to Christian with Halff Associates.
Thanks so much, Jesus. Thank you, Mayor, members of council, for having me. And Jesus, I did take the hint. I will go as rapidly as I possibly can. And actually, for the benefit of council, I will say there are a number of slides that I've got that you have seen from the last presentation, but it was definitely important to kind of reiterate some of those items that are on those slides, because whereas before we were saying, hey, these are preliminary recommendations, now we're at a point in this particular project where there actually are recommendations that are being embedded into the plan. Perfect timing for that to go back out again. I will say, though, in the interest of time, though, I think you've all seen the slide deck in advance of the workshop, and so you can rest assured we will not spend very much time on the topic of restrooms unless you really want us to revisit that topic again. So 3 things that we wanted to talk to you about. We obviously want to give you an update on the status of the master plan. As you know, this plan and all the other master plans that you're working on are nearing completion. So wanted to give you an update on where we were at. Wanted to go back through plan recommendations. Again, some of those recommendations that you had previously seen when we met with you in the Parks and Recreation Commission in May. And then also bring you up to date on revisions that have been proposed for the conceptual development plans for MLK, Ethel E. Tracy, and Riverside Park. So real quick, regarding the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, just to reiterate the purpose of this particular type of plan. And this plan, very, very specifically, is intended to serve as your guide to say, what types of parks do we want to provide our community? What types of recreational facilities, programs, how much, how do we distribute those things, and how do we deliver these parks and recreational services efficiently. The plan itself is actually prepared to adhere to the recommended guidelines of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department so that once a plan is adopted, it actually can be utilized to help you with applications for grant funds from the State Parks Department. As you've seen before, this plan is based, or the planning process is a 4-phased process. We started off just with visioning exercises, talking to the public, doing a general assessment of all of your park system and recreation assets today, developing what we call the blueprint. This is essentially the recommendations based on what we have found throughout the planning process. And then ultimately, we're entering this last phase, what we call commitment. And really what we're talking about is taking those recommendations and working with city staff to build an implementation program, recommendations on how you would implement the plan over a 10-year time frame. We have included both targeted stakeholder outreach and public outreach as part of the master planning process. We not only had city council interviews and met with specific focus groups, but we've also conducted a number of online surveys, had public open houses, actually had a stakeholder design workshop when we initially started work on the 3 conceptual plans, provided materials for city staff to actually hold more public information booths. And actually, the Parks and Recreation Department will be holding another round of public open houses to update individuals on the progress of the plan and the recommendations here within the next few weeks. I'm not entirely certain exactly when that's scheduled for, but it will be upcoming here in the month of October. The plan itself is broken down into 5 chapters. We have submitted 4 draft chapters up to this point, chapters 1 through 4, with chapter 4, Building Parks for All of Us, essentially being the recommendations chapter. We are in the process of preparing chapter 5, the implementation program. There will be a draft of that 5th and final chapter of the plan available, at least for the initial staff review, here also within the next couple weeks. In addition to the plan document itself, there are a series of 3 different appendices that would ultimately be included with the plan document. First and foremost, there would be an appendix that collates or, compiles all of the public outreach that we had, all of the comments that were received, all of the survey results compiled into one appendix document. We have an appendix for all of the conditions assessments and reviews that were conducted by our registered landscape architects regarding the condition of each one of your park spaces today. And then finally, each of these 3 conceptual development plans that are being prepared, the intent would be that these are standalone documents, that the recommendations or the ideas that are contained within those aren't necessarily included within the master plan itself. It's information that would accompany the master plan. The master plan itself would be very general, very generic about investing in those 3 parks specifically in accordance with a number of the recommendations that were prepared as part of the conceptual development planning process. When it comes to the goals that are included in the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, right now there are 4 proposed goals, and actually your 2012 Master Plan had 9 goals in it. And some of these goals really weren't goals at all. They were very much more measurable objectives or even actions. You actually did have a goal, a whole goal on improving restrooms. Well, once again, that's not necessarily at the level that we're working on and preparing a system-wide master plan. Those types of goals are actually best left to more specific and measurable actions. The first goal is about park system growth and access to your park system. The second includes objectives and actions relating to investing in or making improvements into your existing park assets and recreational facilities. The third goal talks about your community programs and events. And the fourth goal, recreational service delivery. This is just really I guess an industry way of saying administer and operate your park system in an efficient manner. Now, on these slides for each one of the 4 goals, the the text that's bolded and underlined, I've just bolded and underlined that for emphasis in the plan. It's not intended that those statements stand out. But when it comes to park system growth and accessibility, the intent is that ultimately the community is providing equitable access to your properties and your recreational amenities. And the objectives and the actions or strategies that are in your plan that relate to this particular goal include actions related to park acquisition, or how you distribute your parks or distribute new recreational facilities, how you connect those facilities via trails network or other improvements to the sidewalk network. Goal number 2, park system investments and improvements. Really, the gist of that is to ensure that you're investing in a way that promotes the longevity of your park system assets. And this particular goal includes objectives and actions and strategies that talk about, again, those existing facilities and assets that you have in your system, how you maintain them, how they're designed on the front end in a way that's resilient, particularly for those properties that are located within the floodplain. When I wasn't looking, was I pressing the button or something? There we go. Park programs and events. The goal statement starts off that personal well-being, public pride is enhanced through the recreational programs that you offer or other vendors in your community offer, the community events that you put on, and also how you promote public health and how your park system can be used to promote the cultural and historical assets in your community. And finally, when it comes to high-quality recreation services and providing those in an efficient manner, once again, that's talking about how do you, on a day-to-day basis, administer and operate your park system? What are you doing in terms of cost recovery or partnerships or investments in your staff to ensure that these services are provided in a cost-effective or cost-efficient manner to your community? So when it comes to plan recommendations, this plan and a lot of the plans we work on divide plan recommendations into 5 different categories. First is financial investments. So when we talk about financial investments, we are talking both about potential capital investments, large-scale investments, but also the operational investments, the monies that you put in on an annual basis to do basic maintenance, to provide basic services. Another type of action that is in the plan is what we call operational change. And really, this simply refers to recommendations that relate on how your staff operates on a day-to-day basis. And largely, these types of recommendations in the plan are really mandates for your staff to run with and actually implement, assuming that they've been included in the final adopted plan. Policy is generally self-explanatory. The plan itself is a policy, but it does include a number of policy statements, the vision statement, and even the goals. Regulation, the Parks and Recreation Master Plan does include some specific recommendations on regulation. That is one recommendation that will take some time to point out. And then the 5th category, and we always like to point this out, the 5th category is potentially additional studies. And we point this out because oftentimes councils will say, well, isn't that what the park plan is? Didn't you just do a study? Well, that's certainly true, but obviously, as we all know, if ultimately you desire to do other things, let's say, like look at building a dog park somewhere, that you may find that because that's a very specific type of amenity, that you may also need to do an additional study to think about suitable locations or to consider suitable designs for that type of amenity. Perfect time. So when we talk about policy within the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, one of the things that comes to the very forefront of policy is what we call level of service. And the Master Plan actually establishes a targeted level of service for parkland and for recreational facilities. And basically, when we say establish a targeted level of service, what we're saying is that the plan establishes a minimum acreage of parkland that you as a community should be trying to achieve. It establishes a minimum distance within which you believe that residents in your community should have a park located close to them. It establishes very similar minimum targets for the amount and type and distribution of recreational facilities you want to provide your community moving forward. But I said this before in May, and we always say this to the communities we're working with, target levels of service are always just advisory and aspirational. So from our perspective, a target is something that you're moving toward. You might not get there in 10 years' time, but if you're moving in that direction, you're successfully implementing your plan. On the flip side, if you exceed that target level of service, that doesn't necessarily mean you stop. If you find that there is your community wants 10 more pickleball courts, and you build 10 more pickleball courts, you might find a few years down the road that the community still wants more. There's no reason not to continue to invest in that. Ultimately, if you have a good, if that's what you determine is necessary to do. Again, these are just advisory, aspirational, something for you to look forward to. Your 2012 Parks and Recreation Master Plan established these types of target levels of service. And in 2012, there was a recommended acreage target that said, well, in 2020, we're going to get to 535 total acres of parkland. Well, my goodness, in 2020, you have almost 850 acres of parkland. And so one would say you've easily met that target level of service. But as we all know, a lot of that acreage, the vast majority of that acreage, is located in one park, in Riverside Park. It's because of that, and because of the fact that so few of your residential areas are actually within a 5-minute or 10-minute walk of a public park, that in addition to parkland acreage targets, this plan also recommends a proximity target, saying that in addition to acreage, you should be striving to distribute parkland throughout your residential areas so that people can actually reside within a quarter or a half-mile walking distance of a park. So the recommendations of this plan as currently written are, when it comes to parkland acreage, maintain that current 2012 standard. You've already met that standard for regional and community parks. As a community, you may have a little bit of work to do in reaching the recommended standard for neighborhood parkland. We also recommend establishing that 1/2 mile walkshed target for neighborhoods. Now, all of these areas in the blue are areas that are not within a 1/2 mile walkshed target of a public park. So once again, when we talk about target levels of service and them being advisory and aspirational, we're not saying that in 10 years' time, all of these areas have to have a park within that walkshed target. The Parks Master Plan is merely suggesting that you move toward trying to reduce some of these service area gaps when it comes to ready, walkable access to your parklands. That can be done in one of two ways. One way is that the city itself can say, within our budget, we are going to go ahead and earmark some funds so that we can go out and retroactively purchase a piece of property within one of these service area deficits and ultimately develop a park. But the other way that most communities that we work with are actually doing this is by incorporating parkland dedication requirements within their land development code to ensure that as they continue to grow, that not only will their service area gap not increase, but they also can close that service area gap as well when you have new subdivisions that are perhaps built within some of the otherwise built-out areas of your community. Likewise, with parkland acreage, there's only a very small percentage of your residential areas that are within a close proximity to a trail. We know, and the survey here in Victoria showed it, we know that every community we go to, trails almost always rank at or near the top of what people want. When it comes to reducing that parkland service area gap, actually trails is a perfect way to do that. Building more trail corridors, you reduce the gaps because you are creating walkable pathways from neighborhoods to your existing parkland assets. This plan actually recommends an additional planned multi-use trail and greenway network of over 50 miles of trail. Now, much of the recommendations are simply taking the Paseo de Victoria biking and hiking plan that you have on the books and incorporating that into the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, but this also includes some additional recommended trail mileage as well. Now, some of the corridors, when it comes to how in the heck can we build all that sort of trail mileage? Well, in some cases, there are going to have to be some specific investments in new segments of trail, particularly where you're talking about trail on corridors that are non-roadway corridors, like a lot of the drainage corridors that the prior group was speaking about. But when it comes to trail along roadway, and this map actually includes potential trail along roadway, oftentimes those trail improvements can be incorporated into an overall roadway reconfiguration and rehabilitation project. One other thing we'll mention about the trails is that this does not provide you a citywide interconnected system of bikeways. You can see on this map, or maybe sort of hard to see at the scale, there's a lot of areas where, a lot of residential areas in the yellow where we're not showing a trail. And that's because there's not an obvious corridor to put a trail in. And even though there may be roadways that have the geometry that would be suitable to put a trail, over time our recommendation is for the city to look at a comprehensive active transportation plan so you can actually consider, if we're going to put a bikeway in a certain location in the built-out portions of the city, is a trail the appropriate facility, or are improved sidewalks and bike lanes or other types of facilities more appropriate in those established areas of the city? Likewise, the plan establishes, and we showed you this graphic in May, the plan establishes recommendations for recreational facilities and recreational facility targets in the city of Victoria. The plan includes a table of very common recreational facilities that you're going to find in most municipal park systems. And what we found in the work we've done in Victoria is that Victoria actually does a pretty good job of meeting targets that are consistent throughout different national organizations and other metrics. That by and large, the level of service that you're providing in most of the recreational facilities in Victoria today are levels of service that should continue into the future. Based on public feedback that we received through the planning process on specialized facilities, we have added a few things here. We are recommending some additional pavilions. We are recommending additional picnic facilities and playgrounds, and we are recommending also dog parks, because when it comes to comments received through survey efforts, dog parks was the most common comment that we received throughout the surveying process in the plan. Now, at this point, there are 61 recommended actions in your Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Do not worry. I know we don't have time to go through all of those. We will not. Wanted to highlight just a handful of those recommendations. One of the recommendations under Goal 1 for your park system growth and accessibility that I haven't already touched on, because we were focusing really on level of service, in the prior slides, is the issue of civic parks or parks in your downtown area. Of course, we're well aware that you are concurrently working on a downtown master plan. And we've spoken with the consultants of that planning process. We're very well aware of the recommendations that they've made in the plan. And we're certainly going to make sure that when it comes to civic parks and the development of new civic space, that the plan that we're developing the final plan is worded in such a way to where it is deferring to the specific recommendations of the downtown master plan. When it comes to growth and accessibility, as we said before, we also recommend the development of parkland dedication standards to be included in the City of Victoria's Land Development Code. I will tell you that when it comes to parkland dedication standards, and if there are any concerns about Victoria's competitiveness, I will say that these types of standards are being incorporated into land development ordinances all over Texas and are going to be found in just about every major city that you compete with in Texas for investment and for economic growth. The intent is to include provisions that in conjunction with developments of certain size that would require either the development of new parkland or the allocation of fees to the city in lieu of that parkland development. The recommendations of this plan, in addition to parkland, would also recommend that where trail corridors are identified in this plan or in the Paseo de Victoria plan, that your parkland dedication standards can also require the reservation of trail easements or even the construction of segments of trail that are located within or adjacent to that development. Yes, ma'am.
In your picture there, you've got a neighborhood park.
Yes.
I believe. What's a minimum size for a neighborhood park?
Yeah, I mean, there is no minimum, but general guidelines.
What's a realistic size?
Realistic, we would say 1 to 3 acres, sometimes even up to 5 acres. But the acreage also, and whether you classify it as a neighborhood park or something else, depends on the types of facilities you put in it also.
Because there's also pocket parks.
Yes.
Okay, and so what's the size? I mean, I'm not that familiar. What's the size of a pocket park?
We would generally say less than 1 acre.
Less than 1 acre, okay.
Yeah. Now, the recommendation in the plan talks about streamback stabilization. And specifically, this recommendation relates to potential improvements to Riverside Park. You know, we heard a lot about we want more views of the river from the park. We want to have pavilions up against the stream bank. If those things are going to be constructed, if there's going to be selected clearance within some stretches of the river, we know how volatile that river channel is, and there has to be significant consideration given to targeted stream bank stabilization in those areas if you're going to invest in streamside facilities within the park. There is, when it comes to park system investments, as we said before, we completed a conditions assessment for all of the parks in your system, and that conditions assessment includes a series of, for each park, a series of recommended improvements to improve the maintenance level of each one of the parks in your system. I think collectively it all amounts to roughly $3.5 to $4 million. I was going to be really shy in telling you that, but then I saw how much all the drainage work is going to cost the City of Victoria. So I know that may be a drop in the bucket by comparison. But ultimately, the plan does include very specific recommendations for each park on minimum improvements to existing facilities that you have that should be made today or in the near future. Regarding new investments, in addition to the conceptual development plans that have been prepared, this plan actually even recommends the expansion of Lone Tree Creek Park. And I say expansion, but in reality, when we're saying expansion, we're thinking about the fact that the city actually owns additional land on the other side of Placido Creek between the creek and U.S. Business 59. And what we're suggesting within the plan itself is that that as part of your trail network, that the trail bridge the creek, proceed to US 59 business and beyond, but on that side of the creek, that may potentially be a good location for a dog park. And the reason why we think that would be a good location for a dog park in relation to Lone Tree Creek Park is that by physically separating it, putting it on the other side of the drainage channel of the creek, you're separating it from the other active facilities that are already in the developed portion of the park. You're keeping that type of use away from residential areas because there always is a conflict between dog parks and existing neighborhoods. And also, that side of the creek, the acreage is vast enough that you have the potential, if you wanted to actually develop an off-leash park. And off-leash parks we're finding actually end up being destination-type facilities for people that want to come into the community. Having a potential access point off of US Business 59 allows people that might want to access a new dog park to be able to do so without necessarily having to come through the neighborhood portion of Lone Tree Creek Park. We've got actions in the plan about walkshed improvements and basically investing in improvements to sidewalks, crosswalks, and facilities of that nature in very close proximity within 1/4 mile of each one of your existing parks. There are recommendations in the plan about evaluating the recreational programs that you offer and third-party vendors offer in terms of program life cycle and actually program age segment analysis. And what we're talking about is when it comes to program life cycle, what are you seeing when it comes to program participation? Is program participation growing? Is it declining? Why is it doing so? Oftentimes we find declining participation means your community doesn't really want it anymore. These are the types of analyses that you have to do as a community on an ongoing basis to make sure that you're offering the right types of programs. There's recommendations in the plan for your staff for how to do that. One other item that I wanted to highlight when it comes to effective service delivery for recreational services, I believe there's a way to mitigate maintenance costs. Not all maintenance costs must necessarily be borne by your Parks and Recreation Department. I believe there's an ad hoc group. What's that group, Jason? The Parks Coalition in Victoria. The Parks Coalition, if it was converted into a Friends of Victoria Park type of organization, basic maintenance projects, volunteer projects are certainly valuable projects that an organization like that could participate in.
Hey, Christian, real quick.
Yeah.
We're running short on time, so can we go through these fairly quickly?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
As you know, we've done 3 conceptual development plans as part of this planning process. One thing that I want to point out about the conceptual development plans, let's emphasize the word concept. Because regardless of what ultimately we're showing you, last time we came to you with ideas, and we said they were ideas. It was the first time we were kind of throwing them out there to you. But even when those ideas have been revised into a concept, it's still a concept. If you look at these graphics, at these plans, and you say, I like most of it, but I don't like all of it, that's just fine, because ultimately nothing gets built. Nothing goes in the ground until you go to the next step and actually do schematic designs for your parks or for portions of your parks. At that point, you can definitely afford to be much more specific about where does the bench go or how close is one playscape to another. So I just wanted to emphasize that that these concepts, there's so much room and flexibility for further changes as you as a community get closer to the design process. In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and skip over some of the existing conditions analysis and even some of the regurgitating some of the feedback we had gotten from the last workshop we held with you. So we'll talk about all three parks as quickly as I can in terms of what we call as complete parks. And what we mean by complete parks are parks that are activated in a way that they're designed and activated in a way that they are as popular as they possibly can be. They get the most amount of use that they can get, and they also have assets in them that build community wealth. Parks that are not well designed, parks that are not well maintained, actually do nothing to improve property value. But there is something called the proximate principle when it comes to park, and we know through lots of data that parks that are well designed, parks that have facilities for everybody and activities for everybody, that these particular parks are parks that actually build community wealth, and you see the direct impact by increased property values for properties that are directly adjacent to or close to these parks. We say complete parks should be accessible. The revised or updated Ethel E. Tracy Park concept, and please, I want to make sure you understand, we definitely heard what you said last time. We hope that these concepts convey what the messages you were trying to give us. So my having skipped over those other slides, I don't want you to think that, I'm just trying to gloss over the fact that you gave us a lot of valuable input last time. But complete parks should be accessible. In this case, there are a number of marked crosswalks that are proposed to provide clear, defined access into and out of MLK Park. The refined or updated park is proposed to be part of a multi-use trail network that would extend further to the north and further to the south. There would be, under this design, improvements to transit accommodation, making sure there was a clear transit stop, a shaded, comfortable transit stop, protected by on-street parking in this case, and certainly trying to create multiple defined points of ingress and egress. A complete park is also safe, and in addition to safe and comfortable. So it's difficult to see in the graphic, but the proposed park revitalization does include border walls or fencing along Callis and Pleasant Green to try to keep the activities in, to try to help parents when it comes to that wayward child that just goes running off. As you can see, it's intended that the park design, even if some existing trees would have to be removed, that they are replaced and that there is a significant amount of tree canopy and shade. Difficult, once again, to see on this specific view, but on the plan view, there are a number of sitting areas in very close proximity to the active center of the park. One thing, along this edge of the ellipse, the plan actually even recommends a seat wall so that there's a seat wall around the ellipse, multiple places to sit and multiple vantage points. There is targeted lighting in different parts of the overall master plan that is included in the cost estimates. And then there is enhanced or improved on-street parking that can help serve as a buffer between the park space itself and cars in the traveled way. These complete parks are social, and what we mean by social is that they can be enjoyed by all people. There are, if you've seen the plan view, I believe the plan view has been provided, right, Jesus?
This slide deck has.
Yeah, there are a diverse set of amenities, whether it's active play areas or passive spaces, the basketball court, the playscapes. The ellipse itself includes fitness stations. There are just informal play areas in the park itself as well. We've got basketball. There we go. I didn't realize I had put it in this next slide. Yeah. And then complete parks are parks that are well maintained. An image can't really show you sufficiently how well maintained is, but well maintained in our business means consolidating, grouping facilities, and it also means incorporating targeted areas of natural space and grouping your landscaping plantings as well. We'll go ahead and Jesus, unless you want me to go back and go ahead.
Go back and what?
hit on some of the prior comments from.
No, I think we only have time to run through the neighborhood parks, especially now that you've explained what a complete park is. Let's just run through them real quick because we're already
Okay.
past the time.
All right.
It's not your fault. So don't take it personal.
I won't. We'll be done here in a few minutes. So I'll just run through it, and hopefully you'll get to see it in time. Pedestrian connections in Ethel E. Tracy Park. A new trail connection to the mall property off to the left of the slide. An access loop for vehicular traffic. This was something that was a big deal, having that secondary access. Additional parking, both within the park itself and then perhaps on the access loop addition, which could also be a public street. I will say real quick that the amount of parking that we're adding is based on an estimated number of total people that could actually fit into the amphitheater at any given time. We're going from, I believe, 214 to 402 parking spaces, and that doesn't even include the on-street. Regarding safety, the plan proposes to push the access drive slightly away from the playground area. But to the point you all made last time, other than that, within the park itself, a lot of that access drive retains the same alignment. Because I think one of you made the point of, why do we want to spend money on moving a road when we want to spend money on the recreation? So we've kept most of the existing road alignment. New neighborhood eyes on the park. We actually showed this concept to the adjacent property owner who seemed amenable to the concept itself. And the idea would be that second access could perhaps be a public street, and that ultimately the development could be developed so that the houses are now facing the park. You have eyes on the park rather than backs to the park. Once again, we have grouped amenities, additional pavilions and seating, a proposed loop trail to gain access to the entire park, amphitheater addition to the actual building, and an access drive or service drive around it that can serve as an additional promenade, restrooms, new restrooms over by the playscape area, and proposed enhancements to the pond. And we'll quickly hit just here for a couple minutes on Riverside Park. One thing I want to point out, what we think we heard last time when it came to Riverside Park is, yes, Riverside Park is our cornerstone park. Yes, it's important to us, but don't try to get too fancy, guys. We know that's what you want to do as planners and landscape architects, but just make what we have better. And so we hope that we've come back with a concept that much more closely adheres to that particular guidance. When it comes to accessible, there are proposed multi-use trail connections, not just within the park itself, but emanating from the park to downtown and adjacent areas, and those connections being consistent with the recommendations of the Downtown Master Plan. There is a potential for a park addition on the northern end and a northern access road that may be able to divert traffic from having to come in directly through a residential street. When it comes to safe and comfortable, it's intended that there be identifiable gateways, marked crosswalks, maintaining your shade canopy, and also the addition of a significant number of new pavilions for shade. As with the other parks, the intent is that activity zones are being grouped, and really in the plan, the major activity zones are adjacent to the new soccer complex, and then on the northern end of the park on the high ground itself.
If we're 10 minutes behind, it's because there was 10 minutes of on and off.
Yeah. Activated, this plan shows a lot of new access points to the river, a lot of new view sheds. It proposes loop trails. I wish I could claim credit for the soccer facility, but apparently one popped up between the last time I talked to you and now. And then maintained, the intent is that the natural areas, particularly the Athey Nature Center, let that be natural. I mean, It's something, it's much easier to maintain in that current state. And frankly, a lot of people go to a park of this nature because they want to be able to get out in nature. This is the closest thing they can get to here within the city of Victoria. Nice new glamour shot of your recreation complex.
I had a question on that. Oops, sorry, I had a question.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
you've got a soccer field on the north side of Red River. You just talked about the Athey Nature facility. Those don't seem compatible.
It's not the same
Not the
land
same.
area. There's already a void where that soccer field is across the street.
Yeah.
Okay,
What's behind it is the golf course.
okay,
And Athey is on this side here.
thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
We include a schematic for a new boat ramp and put in takeout point for your the kayaks in close proximity to the pump house. This is based on plans actually that were provided to us by the Parks and Recreation Department. And then ultimately the plan will include recommendations on building a consistent theme within your park when it comes to fixtures, whether it be gateways or pavilions or a variety of other fixtures, existing restroom buildings and recladding those, things of that nature. So I hustled. I'm sorry if I took too long, folks, but I'm happy to, I'll stay around as long as you want me to answer questions.
And we'll send out via email too the specifics on the conceptual drawings so that you can also have time to review those, at your leisure, and we can also discuss them at our upcoming meeting. Like the other master plans, this master plan is also scheduled to come for adoption, and so we'll obviously share the full document with you too as soon as it's in its final version, with hopefully plenty of time as well before final adoption.
I like the plans the way they stand now. They're a lot better.
Yeah, they pop, yeah. We were joking internally that this is going to probably cause some interest in doing that same for all the other neighborhood parks.
Yes.
But we can cross that bridge when we get to it.
Okay.
The idea, though, is understanding what a complete park is, right? And
Right.
applying those same principles at every park.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you, Christian.
Good
All
job.
right.
Thank you,
And
Jason.
the last item we'll skip.
Yep.
Not a huge priority on the last item on the agenda.
ARPA. All right.
Okay.
And two things. 5:30 p.m.
Yes, sir.
Ribbon cutting at the soccer fields and the Cannonball Run. Ms. Scott reminded us of on Tuesday is
Yeah.
started already at the mall.
Yeah. And tonight's also the fundraiser at the zoo.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wild about wine. Are you going?
Huh?
Wild about wine.
Yes.
All about one.
All right.
Okay. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
I still would like a map.